They told me I had no choice. That duty demanded I marry a man I had never met. I stood before the mirror in my childhood bedroom for the last time, watching my maid fasten the pearl buttons on my traveling dress, and felt the walls of my life closing in like the lid of a coffin. The morning of my departure from Hartwell Manor arrived wrapped in fog, as if even nature sought to obscure the path ahead. I had barely slept, my mind churning with questions that would never be answered. Why had Father arranged this marriage in the final weeks of his life? Why the Duke of Ashford, a man whose reputation preceded him like a winter frost, whose name was spoken in drawing rooms with equal parts fear and fascination? Father had been a kind man, thoughtful in all his decisions, yet in this most crucial matter affecting my future, he had offered no explanation, only a letter delivered by his solicitor 3 days after his funeral. The letter had been brief, almost curt. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, but there was no warmth in what followed. "By the time you read this, I will be gone, and you will think me cruel for what I ask of you. You must marry the Duke of Ashford. The arrangements have been made. Trust that I do this for reasons I cannot explain, but which concern your welfare and your future security. Do not refuse him. Your loving father." I had read those words 100 times, searching for hidden meaning in the ink, finding only the same cold directive. Do not refuse him, as if I possessed any power to refuse. My Aunt Beatrice had accompanied me on the journey north to Ashford Hall, her presence meant to provide comfort, but serving only as a reminder of my isolation. She was my father's sister, a spinster who had spent her life in the shadows of other people's homes, and she watched me now with a mixture of pity and resignation that made my skin crawl. We spoke little during the 2 days of travel. What was there to say? I was being delivered like a parcel, a transaction completed between men I would never fully understand. The countryside changed as we traveled, becoming wilder and more remote. The gentle rolling hills of my childhood gave way to stark moorland, dotted with granite outcroppings that thrust through the earth like broken teeth. Ancient stone walls divided fields where sheep grazed beneath a sky that seemed perpetually gray. This was the north, unforgiving and beautiful in its harshness, and I felt each mile that separated me from home as a physical pain in my chest. Ashford Hall appeared on the 3rd day, rising from the moors like something from a Gothic tale. The house was enormous, built of dark stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Towers flanked the main structure, their windows narrow and watchful. As our carriage approached along the winding drive, I counted 3 floors visible from the front, with more wings extending to either side and disappearing into carefully maintained gardens that looked severe even in their precision. There was no warmth here, no welcoming glow of lamplight in the windows despite the late afternoon hour. The place looked more fortress than home, designed to keep the world at bay. We were received by a housekeeper named Mrs. Blackwood, a woman whose face seemed carved from the same stone as the house itself. She was tall and angular, dressed entirely in black, her hair pulled back so tightly that it stretched the skin of her temples. She curtsied with mechanical precision and informed us that His Grace would receive us in the drawing room after we had refreshed ourselves from the journey. Her voice carried no inflection, no warmth, as if she were announcing the time rather than the meeting that would determine the course of my entire life. My rooms were in the east wing, a suite of 3 chambers connected by heavy wooden doors. The bedroom was dominated by a 4-poster bed hung with dark green velvet, the fabric so thick it seemed to swallow sound. A fire had been lit in the marble fireplace, but it did little to warm the space. The windows looked out over formal gardens, and beyond them the wild expanse of the moors, stretching to a horizon where land and sky merged into a single gray line. I stood at that window for a long time, my hand pressed against the cold glass, and wondered if this view would be my only companion in the years to come. A maid appeared to help me dress for dinner, a young girl named Mary who could not have been more than 16. She worked in silence, her fingers quick and practiced as she changed me from my traveling clothes into an evening gown of deep blue silk. I tried to engage her in conversation, desperate for any information about the household, about the Duke, about what my life here might become. She answered in monosyllables, her eyes fixed on her work, until finally I asked directly about her master. Her hands stilled for just a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "His Grace keeps to himself, miss. We don't see him much about the house. He takes his meals in his study most days, works late into the night. The servants know to stay out of his way." The drawing room where I was finally to meet my husband was on the ground floor, reached by a grand staircase that curved down from the upper galleries. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Ashford ancestors staring down with expressions ranging from stern disapproval to cold indifference. I searched their faces for some hint of the man I was about to meet, but found only the same aristocratic features repeated across decades: strong jawlines, prominent noses, eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the viewer. Aunt Beatrice accompanied me, her hand light on my elbow as if she feared I might bolt. We were announced by a butler whose bearing suggested he had served the family for generations. The drawing room was vast, its walls paneled in dark wood, its furniture upholstered in burgundy and gold. A fire roared in a fireplace large enough to stand in, yet the room still felt cold. And there, standing before that fire with his back to us, was the Duke of Ashford. He did not turn immediately. The butler's announcement seemed to hang in the air, and for several heartbeats the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the rustle of my skirts as I moved further into the room. When he finally did turn, I felt my breath catch. He was younger than I had expected, perhaps 35, with dark hair silvered at the temples and features that would have been handsome had they not been set in such rigid control. His eyes were gray, the color of the sky before a storm, and when they settled on me, I felt as though I were being assessed and found wanting. "Miss Hartwell," he said, and his voice matched his appearance, cold, controlled, utterly devoid of warmth. "I trust your journey was not too arduous." The words were correct, the sentiment expected, but there was no feeling behind them. He might have been discussing the weather with a stranger he would never see again. I managed a curtsy, my training overriding the instinct to flee. "Your Grace," I replied, and was grateful my voice did not tremble. The journey was quite comfortable, thank you. It was a lie. The journey had been miserable, but what else could I say? That I had spent 2 days in a carriage dreading this moment. That every mile had felt like a step toward my own execution? He gestured to the chairs arranged near the fire. "Please, sit. We have arrangements to discuss." Arrangements. Not our future, not our marriage, not even the ceremony itself. Arrangements, as if we were negotiating a business contract rather than a union of lives. I sat, smoothing my skirts with hands that wanted to shake, and waited for him to continue. The Duke remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back, in a military posture that suggested both discipline and distance. "Your father and I had an agreement," he began, his gaze fixed on some point above my head. "That agreement included certain terms regarding this marriage, terms which I intend to honor fully. You will want for nothing materially. This house and all its resources are at your disposal. You will have an allowance appropriate to your station as Duchess of Ashford, and I will make no demands upon your time or your person beyond what society requires for appearances." I stared at him, trying to understand what he was actually saying. Beyond what society requires for appearances. Did he mean what I thought he meant? That this marriage would be in name only? That we would maintain the facade of a union while living essentially separate lives? The realization should have brought relief, but instead, I felt something closer to humiliation. He did not even want me enough to pretend otherwise. I felt Aunt Beatrice shift uncomfortably beside me. "Your Grace," she began, but he cut her off with a slight movement of his hand. "I am aware that this is not what young ladies dream of when they imagine marriage," he continued, and for the first time, a hint of something other than ice entered his voice. something that might have been regret, or perhaps merely fatigue. However, circumstances being what they are, I believe this arrangement will prove satisfactory for both parties. You will have your freedom, Miss Hartwell, within the bounds of propriety. I ask only that you maintain the appearance of a proper marriage when we are in company. And what of heirs? The question escaped before I could stop it, and I felt heat flood my face. But it was a practical concern, one that any woman in my position would have. The continuation of the line was always the primary purpose of aristocratic marriages. His expression hardened, if such a thing were possible. That matter need not concern us at present. My brother has sons. The succession is secure. He turned back to the fire, effectively dismissing the subject, and, it seemed, me as well. The ceremony will take place in 3 days in the private chapel. Only immediate family and essential witnesses will attend. I trust this is acceptable to you. It was not a question, and we both knew I had no choice but to accept. I rose, my legs unsteady beneath me. If that is all, Your Grace, I would like to retire. The journey has been tiring. It was another lie. I was not tired so much as overwhelmed, desperate to escape this cold room and this colder man who would soon be my husband. He inclined his head slightly. Of course. Mrs. Blackwood will see to your needs. I bid you good evening, Miss Hartwell. And with that, I was dismissed as efficiently as if I had been a servant reporting for duty. Aunt Beatrice and I walked back to my rooms in silence. What could either of us say? That my father had condemned me to a loveless marriage with a man who clearly wanted nothing to do with me. That I would spend the rest of my life in this cold house, maintaining appearances for a husband who could barely stand to look at me. The reality of my situation settled over me like a shroud. That night, alone in my bed with its heavy curtains drawn against the darkness, I allowed myself to weep. Not for the love I would never have, for I had long ago resigned myself to a practical marriage. No, I wept for my father, for the warmth of the home I had lost, for the future I had imagined where at least kindness might exist between husband and wife. I wept for the girl I had been just weeks ago, before death and duty had conspired to bring me to this place. The 3 days before the wedding passed in a blur of fittings and preparations that felt surreal in their normalcy. A dressmaker arrived from the village with a wedding gown of cream silk and antique lace, and I stood like a doll while she pinned and tucked and adjusted. The gown was beautiful. I could acknowledge that objectively, but I felt nothing when I looked at myself in the mirror. I was playing a role in a performance I had not auditioned for, speaking lines written by someone else. I saw the Duke only once more before the ceremony, a brief encounter in the main hall when I was returning from a walk in the gardens. He was dressed for riding, his boots and coat suggesting he had just returned from the estate. We nearly collided as I entered through the garden door, and for a moment we stood close enough that I could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight clench of his jaw that suggested constant tension. Up close, I realized there was something haunted in his expression, a darkness that went beyond mere coldness. "Miss Hartwell," he said, stepping back quickly as if my proximity was distasteful. "I hope you are finding everything satisfactory. The same empty courtesy, the same careful distance." "Yes, Your Grace," I replied, matching his formal tone. "Everything is quite satisfactory, thank you. Another lie in a growing collection of them." He nodded once, then moved to step past me. But something made me speak again, some reckless impulse born of desperation. "Your Grace," I began, and he paused, waiting. "I wondered if I might ask you something. About my father. About why he arranged this marriage. Surely you can tell me that much." His face went absolutely rigid, and for a moment I thought he might simply walk away without answering. When he finally spoke, his voice was even colder than before. "Your father had his reasons, Miss Hartwell. Reasons that died with him. I suggest you accept what cannot be changed and make the best of the situation before you. and then he was gone, his boots echoing on the marble floor as he strode away, leaving me standing alone in the hall with more questions than ever. The wedding itself was exactly as he had promised: small, private, efficient. The chapel was a small stone building on the estate grounds, its interior lit by candles that cast wavering shadows on the walls. My aunt stood as my only witness beside a handful of the Duke's family members I was briefly introduced to and immediately forgot. The ceremony was conducted by a local vicar who spoke in a monotone that suggested he performed dozens of such services and found them all equally unremarkable. I spoke my vows in a voice I barely recognized as my own, and when the Duke took my hand to slip the ring onto my finger, his touch was as cold as everything else about him. There was no kiss. The vicar pronounced us man and wife, and the Duke merely nodded to me before turning to sign the register. I watched his hand move across the paper, the scratch of the pen unnaturally loud in the quiet chapel. Then it was my turn, and I signed my name for the last time, Eleanor Hartwell. When I lifted the pen, I was Eleanor Ashford, Duchess of Ashford, and the girl I had been ceased to exist. A brief wedding breakfast was served in the smaller dining room, a meal I could not eat, despite the obvious quality of the food. The Duke sat at the head of the table, responding to the few attempts at conversation with monosyllabic replies that eventually silenced even the most determined speakers. I sat beside him, the ring heavy on my finger, and wondered how many years of such meals stretched ahead of me. How many silent breakfasts, formal dinners, empty exchanges of meaningless courtesy. By late afternoon, the few guests had departed, and I was alone in my rooms once more. Mary helped me out of the wedding gown, hanging it carefully in the wardrobe where it would remain unworn and unnecessary, a symbol of a marriage that was no marriage at all. I stood at the window in my dressing gown, looking out at the moors as the sun set behind clouds, painting the sky in shades of gray and purple. Somewhere in this vast house was my husband, likely in his study, working or reading or doing whatever it was he did in his solitude. Would he come to me tonight? I wondered. Despite his words about no demands upon my person, surely tradition required something on a wedding night. But the hours passed, and no one came. The fire burned low in the grate. Mary brought tea and biscuits I did not touch, then returned to take the tray away. The house settled into nighttime silence, that particular quality of quiet that exists in large old buildings where every creak of wood and whisper of draught seems magnified. I climbed into the massive bed alone, pulled the curtains around me, and lay in the darkness trying to understand how my life had arrived at this point. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of my father. He was sitting in his study at Hartwell Manor as he had done every evening, the lamplight casting warm shadows across his desk. But when I entered the room in the dream, he would not look at me. He kept writing, his pen moving steadily across paper, and no matter how I called to him, he never lifted his head. I woke with tears on my face and a certainty that I would never understand why he had done this to me, why he had sent me to this cold place with this cold man. The days that followed established what would become the pattern of my life at Ashford Hall. I took breakfast alone in my rooms. I walked in the gardens or read in the morning room. I took tea alone. I dressed for dinner and went down to the dining room where the Duke and I sat at opposite ends of a long table, servants moving silently between us, and exchanged perhaps a dozen words over the course of the meal. Afterward, he would retire to his study and I to my rooms, and we would not see each other again until the following evening. It was a lonely existence, but I told myself it was bearable. I had my books, my walks, my thoughts. Many women had endured worse, but questions haunted me. Why had my father insisted on this particular match? The Duke had said father had his reasons, but what could possibly justify condemning his only daughter to such isolation? What agreement had existed between them? And why did the Duke himself seem so determined to maintain such distance, as if my very presence pained him? Sometimes, late at night when I could not sleep, I would walk the corridors of the East Wing, and I would notice light coming from beneath the door of his study in the West Wing, visible across the gallery. He kept late hours, working at something that required lamps burning until dawn. What occupied him so completely that he could not spare even basic courtesy for his wife? 3 weeks into my marriage, I made a discovery that would change everything. I had been exploring the house, slowly learning its geography, and I found myself in the library on a rainy afternoon when walking outdoors was impossible. It was a beautiful room, 2 stories high with galleries running around the upper level and shelves reaching to the ceiling. The books were arranged by subject, and I was searching for something on botany when I noticed a section that seemed different from the rest. The volumes here were uniform, bound in dark leather, with no titles on their spines. Curious? I pulled one down and opened it at random. It was a diary written in a firm, masculine hand. The Duke's hand, I realized, recognizing it from the marriage register and various documents I had seen. My first instinct was to replace it immediately. These were private thoughts, not meant for anyone else's eyes. But as I moved to slide it back onto the shelf, a name caught my eye. Hartwell, my family name, there in the Duke's private diary. My heart beginning to pound, I turned back to the entry and began to read. The words I found there would haunt me forever. August 15th, the entry began. I have agreed to Hartwell's proposal, though it sits like poison in my gut. He knows what I did, has known for years apparently, and now demands payment for his silence. The price is his daughter. I am to marry the girl, provide for her, give her the protection of my name and title. In exchange, he will take the truth to his grave. It is blackmail of the cruelest sort, using an innocent child as leverage. But what choice do I have? If the truth came out, it would destroy not just me, but everyone connected to the Ashford name. I could not breathe, could not move. The book shook in my hands as I read the words again, trying to make sense of them. He knows what I did. Payment for his silence. Blackmail. My father had blackmailed the Duke of Ashford into marrying me? My kind, gentle father who had read to me every night as a child, who had taught me to ride and to dance, who had held my hand through my mother's death. That man had been a blackmailer. And what truth was so terrible that the Duke would agree to a forced marriage to keep it hidden? What had he done? I turned the pages with trembling fingers, searching for more information, but the next several entries dealt with estate matters and made no mention of my father or the agreement between them. I pulled down another volume, this one older, the pages yellowed with age. I flipped through it randomly, looking for any mention of my family name, of whatever secret my father had held over this man. It took nearly an hour of searching, but I finally found it. An entry from 10 years ago, written in a hand that was less controlled than the later volumes, the letters jagged with emotion. I have killed a man. The words stood stark on the page. There is no other way to say it, no way to soften the truth. Richard Hartwell is dead because of my actions, because of my pride and my anger and my refusal to listen to reason. We were racing, foolish and drunk on youth and competition, and I drove him off the road. I watched his carriage overturn, watched it roll down the embankment, and I did nothing. I rode away and left him there, and by the time anyone found him, he was dead. They called it an accident, blamed the weather and the roads, and I said nothing. I have lived with this weight for 6 months now, and I do not know how to bear it much longer. The book fell from my hands and hit the floor with a sound like thunder. Richard Hartwell, my uncle, my father's younger brother. I had never known him. He had died before I was born, but I had heard the stories. A carriage accident on a country road, tragic and sudden. My father had rarely spoken of him, and when he did, there was always such sadness in his voice that I had learned not to ask questions. And now I knew why. My father had known the truth all along. had known that his brother's death was not an accident, but the result of reckless negligence, if not outright malice. I sank into a chair, my mind reeling. The Duke had killed my uncle, and my father had used that knowledge to force him into marriage with me. But why? Why would father do such a thing? Revenge? Some twisted form of justice? Or had there been something more? Some reason he believed binding the Duke to our family would somehow balance the scales? And the Duke himself, the cold, distant man who could barely look at me. Did he see his victim when he looked at my face? Did I remind him every day of the guilt he carried, the crime he had committed and escaped punishment for? No wonder he kept his distance. No wonder he seemed to view our marriage as a prison sentence rather than a union. I was his living penance, forced upon him by a man who had every right to hate him. I do not know how long I sat there in that library, the diary pages spread around me, the weight of these revelations pressing down like a physical force. Outside, the rain had intensified, beating against the windows in waves. The light was fading, afternoon giving way to evening, and still I could not move. Everything I had believed about my father, about this marriage, about my husband, had been shattered in the space of a few diary entries. I was not here because my father loved me and wanted to secure my future. I was here because he had used me as an instrument of revenge, a punishment inflicted on the man who had killed his brother. The question was, what did I do now? Confront the Duke with what I had learned? Demand explanations, answers to the 100 questions racing through my mind? Or did I remain silent, pretend ignorance, continue playing the role of the obedient wife who asked no questions and expected nothing? Both paths seemed impossible, yet I would have to choose one. Because now that I knew the truth, or at least part of it, everything had changed. I could not unknow what I had learned, could not unsee those words written in my husband's hand. I have killed a man, and my father's response had been to sell his daughter into a marriage with that man. I gathered the diaries carefully, returning them to their places on the shelf with shaking hands. Then I fled the library, my footsteps echoing through empty corridors as I ran back to the safety of my rooms. Mary was there, laying out my evening gown, and she looked up in surprise at my sudden entrance. "Are you well, Your Grace?" she asked, and the title still sounded strange to my ears. "You look quite pale." "I am fine," I managed, though I was anything but. "Just tired. I think I will not go down to dinner tonight. Please inform His Grace that I am indisposed." I could not face him across that long table, could not sit there knowing what I now knew, pretending everything was normal when my entire world had been turned inside out. That night I lay awake long after the house had fallen silent, staring at the canopy above my bed and trying to understand the choices that had brought me to this moment. My father, my beloved father, had been capable of blackmail. The Duke, my husband, was a killer, and I was caught between them, a pawn in a game I had not known existed until it was far too late to escape. Tomorrow, I would have to decide what to do with this terrible knowledge. Tonight, I could only lie in the darkness and mourn for the innocence I had lost, for the simple life I had believed in that had never really existed at all. Morning came too soon, pale light filtering through the heavy curtains to find me still awake, still trapped in the maze of my thoughts. I had not slept at all, my mind circling endlessly around the revelations of the previous day. Mary entered with my breakfast tray, setting it on the table by the window with her usual quiet efficiency, but I could not eat. The thought of food turned my stomach. I sent her away and dressed myself, choosing a simple day dress of gray wool that matched my mood, then stood at the mirror brushing my hair with mechanical strokes while my reflection stared back at me like a stranger. I could not hide in my rooms forever, though part of me wanted to. Eventually, I would have to face the Duke, would have to sit across from him at dinner and make polite conversation while this terrible knowledge burned inside me like acid. But first, I needed to understand more. The diary entries I had found raised as many questions as they answered. How had my father discovered the truth about Uncle Richard's death? When had he first confronted the Duke with this knowledge? And most importantly, why had he waited until he was dying to demand this particular price for his silence? The library drew me back like a magnet. I waited until mid-morning, when I knew the Duke would be out riding as was his custom, then slipped through the corridors and up the stairs to that vast room with its walls of books. The diaries were where I had left them, innocuous in their uniform bindings, holding secrets that could destroy lives. This time I was methodical, pulling down each volume in sequence and searching for any mention of my family, any reference to the accident or its aftermath. What I found painted a picture more complex than I had imagined. The Duke had been 25 when Uncle Richard died, young and arrogant and careless in the way of aristocratic sons who had never known real consequence for their actions. The racing had been his idea. A drunken challenge issued at a country house party where both men were guests. They had ridden through the night on unfamiliar roads, and the Duke's competitive nature had driven him to take risks that grew more reckless with each mile. When Uncle Richard's horse stumbled and his carriage veered off the road, overturning in a ditch, the Duke had reined in his own mount and looked back. The diary entry describing that moment was brutally honest. I saw him there, trapped beneath the wreckage, and I knew I should go back, knew I should call for help. But I was terrified of the scandal, of what my father would say, of how this would ruin everything I had planned for my future. So I rode on. I told myself he would be fine, that someone else would find him soon. I have never been able to forgive myself for that cowardice. By the time help arrived, Uncle Richard had been dead for hours. The inquest ruled it an accidental death, and the Duke had attended the funeral, standing in the churchyard with the other mourners, accepting condolences from my father, who had no idea his brother's death was anything but a tragic accident. The guilt had eaten at the Duke for months, evident in the increasingly desperate tone of his diary entries. I see his face when I close my eyes, hear the sound of the wood splintering, the horse screaming. I am haunted by what I did, by what I failed to do. And yet I cannot confess. To speak the truth now would serve no purpose except to ease my own conscience at the expense of his family's peace. But my father had somehow learned the truth. The diary entry from 5 years ago, when my father first confronted him, described the meeting in stark terms. Hartwell came to me today with knowledge he should not possess. He knows about Richard, knows what really happened that night. He has proof, he claims, though he would not say what form this proof takes. A witness, perhaps, or something I said in my cups that was overheard and repeated. It does not matter. He knows, and yet he does not seek justice in any conventional sense. He made no threats, demanded no public confession. He simply wanted me to know that he knew, that my secret was no longer entirely my own. Then he left, and I have spent the hours since wondering what price he will eventually demand for his silence. That price had come 3 months ago, when my father knew he was dying. The entry was dated just weeks before his death. Hartwell has returned, and now I understand the purpose of his long silence. He is dying, consumption, the doctors say, and he wants to secure his daughter's future before he goes. His proposal is diabolical in its simplicity. I am to marry Eleanor Hartwell, provide for her as befits a duchess, give her the protection of my name and title. In return, the evidence of my crime dies with him. If I refuse, he will send the proof to the magistrate and let justice take its course, even from beyond the grave. He knows I have no choice. The scandal would destroy my family, ruin my sister's prospects, disgrace my father's memory. So I have agreed. God forgive me, I have agreed to marry an innocent girl as payment for killing her uncle. I closed the diary, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. So that was the full truth. My father had used me, had bartered me away to secure his revenge from beyond the grave. He had ensured that the Duke of Ashford would spend the rest of his life shackled to a daily reminder of his crime, that every time he looked at me, he would see the face of the man he had killed and abandoned. It was a punishment far crueler than any prison sentence, and I was the instrument of that punishment, wielded by a dead man against a living one. And yet I could not entirely condemn my father, not when I thought of Uncle Richard lying broken in that ditch while the Duke rode away. My father had lost his only brother to careless arrogance, had buried him believing it was simply a tragic accident, then discovered years later the truth of his death. What would anyone do with such knowledge? The law would have been useless after so much time had passed. There were no witnesses, no evidence beyond whatever proof my father had somehow obtained. Traditional justice was impossible, so he had crafted his own justice, one that would last beyond his death and ensure the Duke never forgot what he had done. But what about me? I had been given no choice, no voice in this arrangement. I was as much a victim as anyone, caught between the sins of the past and forced to live out the consequences of decisions made by men who had never asked what I wanted or needed. The anger that rose in me then was so fierce it left me breathless. Anger at my father for using me this way. Anger at the Duke for the cowardice that had started this whole terrible chain of events. Anger at Uncle Richard for accepting that stupid racing challenge in the first place, though that was unfair, and I knew it. Mostly I was angry at the unfairness of it all, at the way women were moved about like chess pieces in games played by men with no regard for our own desires or dignity. I returned the diaries to their places and left the library, walking blindly through the house until I found myself in the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with exotic plants that the previous Duchess had apparently cultivated. It was warmer here, humid with the moisture of growing things, and I sank onto a bench among the ferns and palms and let myself cry. Not the quiet, restrained tears of the well-bred lady I had been raised to be, but great gulping sobs that shook my whole body. I cried for my father, whose love had been twisted by grief and anger into something cruel. I cried for my uncle, who had died alone in the darkness. I cried for the Duke, burdened by guilt that had shaped his entire adult life. And I cried for myself, for the future I would never have, for the choices that had been stolen from me. I do not know how long I sat there, but eventually the storm of weeping passed and left me hollow and exhausted. The light had shifted, afternoon sun slanting through the glass roof and casting patterns on the stone floor. My eyes felt swollen, my throat raw, but there was also a strange clarity that came with having emptied myself of tears. I could not change the past, could not undo my father's blackmail or the Duke's crime, but I could choose how I moved forward from this moment. I could choose what kind of person I would be in this impossible situation. The first choice I made was to confront him, not immediately, not in the heat of raw emotion, but soon. He deserved to know that I knew the truth, that I understood why this marriage existed and what it meant. We could not continue as we had been, maintaining this cold distance based on a lie of ignorance. If we were to spend our lives together, however loveless that existence might be, it had to be built on honesty rather than secrets. I spent the next 2 days preparing myself, rehearsing in my mind what I would say and how I would say it. I did not want to accuse or condemn. Despite everything, I found I could not entirely hate him. The young man who had made that terrible choice was not the man he was now. The guilt evident in his diary entries, the punishment he had inflicted on himself through years of isolation and self-recrimination, spoke to a conscience that had never stopped holding him accountable. In some ways, my father's revenge had been unnecessary. The Duke had been his own harshest judge long before I arrived at Ashford Hall. On the third evening after my discovery, I did not go up to my rooms after dinner as was my habit. Instead, when the Duke rose to retire to his study, I spoke. "Your Grace," I said, and my voice was steadier than I had expected. "Might I have a word with you? In private?" He turned, surprise evident on his face. It was perhaps the first time I had initiated any conversation beyond the most basic pleasantries, and he clearly did not know what to make of it. "Of course," he said after a moment's hesitation. "We can speak in my study." He led the way through corridors I had never walked before, to the west wing where his private rooms were located. The study was exactly what I had expected: dark wood paneling, heavy furniture, walls lined with books and papers. A fire burned low in the grate, and a desk stood before the window, covered with documents and correspondence. This was where he spent his evenings, working late into the night, and I wondered if it was work that kept him here, or simply the desire to avoid the rest of the house, to avoid me. He gestured to a chair near the fire, and I sat, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling. He remained standing, his posture stiff, waiting for me to speak. For a moment I almost lost my courage. But then I thought of those diary entries, of all the lies and secrets that had brought us to this point, and I forced myself to begin. "I have discovered something," I said quietly. "Something I do not think you intended me to find. I have read your diaries, the ones in the library. I know about my Uncle Richard. I know about my father's blackmail. I know why we are married." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, and I watched the impact ripple across his face. First shock, then something like horror, and finally a resignation so complete it was painful to witness. He turned away from me, moving to stand before the fire with his back rigid. "How much do you know?" His voice was barely audible, rough with an emotion he was clearly fighting to control. "I know that you were involved in his death, that you left him there and never told anyone the truth. I know that my father discovered this somehow and used it to force you into marrying me." I paused, then added more gently, "I know that you have carried this guilt for 10 years, that it has shaped everything about your life, about who you have become." He was silent for a long time, so long I began to think he would not respond at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "I have thought about that night every day since it happened. Not a day passes that I do not see his face. Do not wonder if I had gone back immediately, whether he might have lived. The guilt has been my constant companion, my punishment." And then your father appeared with his proposal, and I understood that my punishment was not finished, that I would spend the rest of my life looking at you and seeing the man I killed, your uncle, your father's brother. He turned to face me then, and I was shocked by the raw pain in his eyes. "I expected you to hate me," he continued. "Expected that your father had told you everything, that you were complicit in this arrangement. When I realized you knew nothing, that you were as much a victim of your father's scheme as I was, it made it worse somehow. You did not deserve this, did not deserve to be married to a man who can barely stand to be in the same room with you, not because of anything you have done, but because your very existence is a reminder of my greatest shame." "I should hate you," I said slowly, thinking through each word carefully. "By any reasonable standard, I should despise you for what you did and for the cowardice you showed afterward. But I find that I cannot, perhaps because I have read your own words, seen the toll this guilt has taken. Perhaps because I understand that the man you were at 25 is not the man you are now. Or perhaps because I am simply too tired to carry that much hatred. There has been enough pain already." He stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. "You cannot mean that. How can you not hate me?" "Because hate would serve no purpose," I replied. "It would not bring my uncle back, would not undo my father's blackmail or this marriage. All it would do is make both our lives more miserable than they already are. And that seems pointless. We are bound together now for better or worse. The question is not whether we can change the past, but whether we can find some way to live with it." I stood and walked to where he stood, close enough that I could see the individual threads of silver in his dark hair, the lines of strain around his mouth. "I want to propose something," I said. "A truce, if you will. We cannot be the husband and wife that society expects. Perhaps we can never be that. But we could be honest with each other. We could stop pretending. You do not have to avoid me as if my presence causes you physical pain. I do not have to pretend I am content with this hollow mockery of a marriage. We could simply be two people trying to survive a situation neither of us chose, and perhaps find some measure of peace in that honesty. His eyes searched my face as if looking for some trap, some hidden accusation. Why would you offer me that? After everything I have taken from you, all the ways I have failed you already? Because I am tired of being alone in this vast house, I answered. And it was the most honest thing I had said since arriving at Ashford Hall. Because I am tired of silence and distance and the weight of all these secrets. Because my father used us both, and continuing to punish each other serves only his memory, not our lives. And because, she added more softly, I think we both deserve better than this living death we have been enduring. Something shifted in his expression then, a crack in the icy control he maintained so carefully. You are far more generous than I deserve, he said quietly, far kinder than I have any right to expect. I do not know if I can be what you need, what any wife would need, but I can try to be honest, as you suggest, can try to stop hiding from you, from this situation. If you truly do not hate me, if you can bear my presence knowing what you now know, then yes. A truce. An attempt at honesty at least. I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I had not fully realized I was carrying. Thank you, I said simply. That is all I ask. Not love, not even affection. Just honesty and the willingness to try. We stood there for a moment longer, the fire crackling softly behind us, and for the first time since I had arrived at Ashford Hall, I felt a small spark of hope. It was fragile, easily extinguished, but it was there. Perhaps we could not have a real marriage, but we might have something more than the cold arrangement we had been enduring. We might have a partnership built on the ruins of the past, acknowledging the pain while not being destroyed by it. The Duke cleared his throat, a gesture that seemed almost nervous. Would you care for tea? He asked, and the mundane domesticity of the question after such a conversation was almost absurd. But I understood what he was really asking. Could we sit together without the weight of formality and distance that had defined every previous interaction? Could we try to simply be in the same room without all the walls we had built? I would like that, I said. Very much. He rang for a servant, and soon we were seated in chairs before the fire with a tea service between us. The conversation was stilted at first, both of us unsure how to navigate this new territory. But gradually, as the evening wore on, we began to speak more easily. He told me about the estate, about the tenants and the farms, and the ongoing repairs to the north wing. I told him about my childhood at Hartwell Manor, about my love of reading and my amateur attempts at watercolor painting. They were small things, ordinary things, the kind of conversation any married couple might have. But for us, they felt revolutionary. When I finally rose to retire to my rooms, it was late, far later than I had stayed up since coming to Ashford Hall. He walked me to the door of his study, a courtesy he had never shown before. Eleanor, he said, using my given name for the first time, and I paused. Thank you for your honesty tonight, for your unexpected mercy. I do not deserve it, but I am grateful nonetheless. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak past the lump in my throat, and made my way back through the now familiar corridors to my chambers. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. The weight of secrets had been crushing me without my fully realizing it, and now that the truth was spoken aloud between us, I could breathe more easily. Our marriage was still a strange arrangement, built on a foundation of tragedy and blackmail, but at least now it was honest. At least now, we were not strangers living in careful avoidance of each other. The days that followed were different, in subtle but important ways. The Duke, I could not yet think of him as anything else, still kept largely to his own pursuits, but he no longer avoided me with such obvious determination. We began to take breakfast together, a simple meal in the morning room where sunlight streamed through tall windows and we could speak of ordinary things. He showed me parts of the estate I had not yet seen, the stables where his horses were kept, The home farm where tenants worked land that had been Ashford property for generations, the folly on the hill that offered views across the moors to the distant sea. I learned things about him that the cold exterior had hidden. He was intelligent, widely read, with opinions on everything from agricultural reform to the role of the aristocracy in modern society. He had a dry wit that occasionally surfaced in conversation, catching me by surprise and making me laugh despite myself. And he was lonely, I realized. As lonely as I was, isolated by his guilt and his secrets, unable to form real connections because of the walls he had built to keep everyone at arm's length. One afternoon, about a week after our conversation in the study, I found him in the library, standing before the section where the diaries were kept. He turned when he heard me enter, and there was something vulnerable in his expression. "I have been thinking," he said without preamble, "that perhaps you should read all of them. Not just the entries about your uncle, but everything. If we are to have honesty between us, you should know all of it. The man I was, the mistakes I have made, the person I have tried to become. I will not hide behind edited versions of my life." I moved to stand beside him, looking at the rows of identical leather volumes. "Are you certain?" I asked. "Some things, once known, cannot be unknown, and there may be matters in those pages that cause you pain to have revealed." He smiled then, a sad, wry expression. "There is little in my life that does not cause me pain when examined too closely. But yes, I am certain. You deserve to understand the full story, not just the parts that directly involve your family." So I began to read. Not all at once, for there were dozens of volumes covering more than 15 years, but slowly, over the course of several weeks. I read about his childhood, raised by a stern father and a mother who died when he was young, leaving him to navigate the world without her gentling influence. I read about his years at university, his friendships and rivalries, his growing arrogance as he came into his title and fortune. I read about the night Uncle Richard died, the full account more detailed and more haunting than the brief entry I had first discovered. But I also read about the aftermath, the slow dissolution of the careless young aristocrat into something harder and more isolated. He had withdrawn from society, stopped attending the parties and hunts that had once occupied his time. He had thrown himself into managing the estate, learning everything he could about agriculture and business, determined to be responsible in some way, even if he could not make amends for the past. He had never married, never even courted anyone seriously, despite the pressure from his family. Looking back now, I understood why. He had not felt he deserved that kind of happiness, that kind of normal life. There were other revelations in those pages. I learned about his struggles with his father, who had wanted him to pursue a political career and been disappointed when he refused. I learned about his sisters, whom he clearly loved despite maintaining distance from them. I learned about tenants he had helped through difficult times, charities he supported quietly without seeking recognition. I learned that the cold, distant man I had married was capable of great kindness when he allowed himself to be, and that his isolation was as much self-punishment as protection. One entry, written just after our marriage, struck me particularly hard. "I have married Eleanor Hartwell today," he had written, and with that act sealed both our fates. "She is so young, so obviously unhappy, and I am the cause of that unhappiness in ways she does not yet understand." I look at her and see not just Richard's ghost, but all the ways I have failed to be a decent man. I have agreed to her father's terms, will provide for her materially as promised, but I cannot give her what she truly deserves, a husband who can love her, who can make her happy. I am too broken for that, too stained by guilt. The best I can offer is distance, the hope that she will find contentment in the freedom I can provide, in knowing I will make no demands upon her. It is a cold comfort, but it is all I have to give. Reading that, I felt tears prick my eyes. He had been trying to be kind in his own way, trying to give me freedom within the constraints of an impossible situation. That he had failed to understand that freedom without connection is its own kind of prison was not malice, but simply ignorance. He had been so focused on his own guilt that he had not seen my loneliness, my need for human warmth and companionship. But now, with honesty between us, perhaps that could change. I told him as much one evening when we were sitting together after dinner, a habit we had fallen into over the past weeks. We no longer ate at opposite ends of that long table, but sat near each other, close enough for normal conversation, and afterward we would retire to the library or the drawing room and talk or read in companionable silence. "I read this today," I said, showing him the entry about our wedding day. "You were trying to be kind. I understand that now. But you should know that distance, however well-intentioned, is not the same as freedom. I would rather have your honest company, even with all the pain that attends it, than the empty freedom of isolation." He looked at the page, at his own words written months ago, and something like shame crossed his face. "I handled it all so poorly," he said quietly. "Was so focused on my own guilt that I never stopped to consider what you might actually need or want. I am sorry for that, Eleanor. Sorry for all the ways I have failed you as a husband." "You are not failing me now," I replied, and it was true. In the weeks since our conversation in his study, he had been present in ways I had not anticipated. Not as a romantic husband. We were not there and might never be, but as a companion, a friend of sorts. Someone I could talk to, could rely upon. It was not what I had imagined marriage would be, but it was infinitely better than the cold isolation I had endured in those first terrible weeks. As winter deepened and the moors became dusted with snow, I found myself settling into a rhythm of life at Ashford Hall that was not entirely unpleasant. I had my rooms, my books, my walks when weather permitted. I had Mary's quiet company and Mrs. Blackwood's efficient management of the household. And I had the Duke, whose name I learned was Marcus, though I still called him by his title most of the time, out of habit, and because the intimacy of given names felt like a step we had not quite earned yet. But the greatest gift of those weeks was the lifting of the burden of secrets. We could speak honestly about the past, about my father and my uncle, about the guilt he carried, and the anger I sometimes felt. We did not always agree. There were evenings when old resentments surfaced, when I would look at him and see the young man who had ridden away from a dying man, and he would see the accusation in my eyes and withdraw into himself. But we were learning to navigate those moments, to speak about the difficult things instead of letting them fester in silence. One night, when the fire had burned low and we had both had perhaps more wine than was wise, I asked him the question that had haunted me since I first read his diaries. "Do you think my uncle would have survived if you had gone back immediately? If you had called for help right away instead of riding on?" He was quiet for so long I thought he would not answer, but finally he spoke, his voice raw with old pain. "I do not know," he said. "I have asked myself that question 10,000 times, and I do not know. Perhaps. Perhaps not. The fall was severe, the injuries likely catastrophic. But I did not give him the chance. I prioritized my own fear over his life, and that is the choice I have to live with. Whether he would have survived is ultimately unknowable. What I know is that I denied him any possibility of survival by my cowardice." I nodded, accepting the honesty of that answer, even though it brought no comfort. "And my father," I asked, "when did you stop hating him for what he did? For forcing this marriage?" Again that long silence, and when he answered, his words were careful, measured. "I am not certain I have stopped," he admitted. "What he did was cruel, using you as an instrument of punishment, binding us both to a lifetime of this awkwardness and pain. But I also understand his rage. I took his brother from him, robbed him of family, and then lived comfortably with my secret while he grieved. If our positions were reversed, if someone had killed my sister and escaped justice, I do not know that I would have been more merciful. Hate is perhaps too strong a word. I resent the method he chose, but I cannot claim his desire for punishment was unjustified. That night marked another shift between us, subtle but significant. We were no longer just two people forced into an arrangement, trying to make the best of an impossible situation. We were beginning to understand each other, to see past the roles we had been assigned to the complicated human beings beneath. It was not love. I was careful not to confuse what we were building with romantic feeling. But it was connection, and in my isolation, that mattered more than I could easily express. The year was drawing to a close. Winter settled firmly over the moors, when another discovery changed everything again. I had been feeling unwell for several days, a persistent nausea that made breakfast impossible and left me exhausted by mid-afternoon. I had dismissed it as a passing illness, but when Mary suggested quietly that perhaps I should see a doctor, the implication of her words struck me like a physical blow. I counted back the weeks, counting and recounting, and felt the world tilt beneath my feet. It should have been impossible. The Duke and I had never, not once since our marriage, been together in that way. He had promised that he would make no demands upon me, and he had kept that promise absolutely. We shared conversation and companionship now, but never anything more intimate. And yet the signs were unmistakable, and when the doctor arrived from the village and conducted his examination, he confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. I was with child, approximately 3 months along, and that meant the conception had occurred before I ever arrived at Ashford Hall, before my marriage, and there had only been one man, one single terrible night I had tried so hard to forget. I sat in my room after the doctor left, his congratulations ringing hollow in my ears, and tried to understand how my life had become so impossibly tangled. I would have to tell the Duke, would have to confess that I was carrying another man's child, conceived in circumstances I could barely stand to remember. Would have to watch whatever trust and companionship we had built shatter under the weight of this revelation. Because how could he accept this? A wife who was not only forced upon him, but who now carried physical proof of betrayal, of a past he knew nothing about. The question was not whether to tell him, but how. And what would become of us, of the fragile understanding we had built? When he learned the truth? I had no answers, only the growing certainty that everything was about to change once more, and this time I feared it would be for the worse. I spent 3 days in my rooms, claiming continued illness, while I tried to find the courage to tell him. Mary brought meals I could not eat, her eyes worried, but her questions carefully unasked. Mrs. Blackwood appeared once to inquire whether I required a doctor's return visit, and I sent her away with assurances I would be fine. But I was not fine. I was terrified, ashamed, and utterly alone with a secret that grew heavier with each passing hour. The truth was this: 6 weeks before my father's death, I had traveled to London with my aunt for the season. It was to be my first real introduction to society, a chance to meet eligible gentlemen and perhaps form an attachment that might lead to marriage. I had been nervous but excited, imagining ballrooms and romance like something from the novels I loved to read. What I had not imagined was Lord Pemberton, a charming rake 20 years my senior, who had singled me out at a garden party and paid me attentions that I, in my inexperience, had mistaken for genuine affection. He had been handsome, witty, seemingly enchanted by my naivete. He had sent flowers, written poetry, stolen moments alone with me in darkened alcoves and moonlit terraces. I had thought myself in love, thought he intended to offer for me. And then one night, at a ball where my aunt had been distracted by cards, he had suggested we take air on the balcony. I had gone willingly, trustingly, and when he had led me further, into an unused room, I had not protested until it was far too late. I would not call it force exactly, though neither was it truly consent. I had been young, stupid, overwhelmed by sensations and promises I did not fully understand. He had whispered words of love and forever, had assured me this was what people who cared for each other did, had made it all seem inevitable and right. By the time I understood what was actually happening, it was already done. He had straightened his clothes, kissed my forehead, and told me to compose myself before returning to the ballroom. 2 days later, he departed London for his country estate, and I never saw him again. The letters I had written went unanswered. The flowers stopped arriving. It was as if I had dreamed the entire courtship, except for the sick knowledge of what I had allowed to happen and the growing fear that there would be consequences. Then, my father had fallen ill, and I had returned home to Hartwell Manor to nurse him through his final weeks. I had been so consumed with grief and fear for him that I had not even noticed the signs of pregnancy, had not realized until my wedding night had come and gone without consummation that there would be no way to hide what had happened. And now here I was, married to a man who believed me innocent, carrying another man's child, and trapped in a web of lies that seemed to multiply every time I tried to untangle them. I knew I could not hide it forever. Soon the pregnancy would begin to show, and then questions would arise that I could not answer without revealing the truth. Better to tell him now, before he heard it from servants' gossip or figured it out himself. Better to face his anger and disappointment directly than to let him discover it through humiliation. But knowing what I should do and finding the strength to do it were entirely different matters. On the 4th morning, I woke to find a note had been slipped under my door. "Eleanor," it read in the Duke's firm hand, "I hope you are feeling better. If you are well enough, would you join me for tea in the conservatory this afternoon?" I find I have missed our conversations. The simple kindness of those words nearly broke me. He had missed our conversations. He valued what we had built together, and I was about to destroy it all. I dressed carefully, choosing a gown with a loose waist that would hide my condition a while longer, though that felt like just another deception. When I arrived at the conservatory, I found he had arranged everything himself: a small table set with tea things, cushioned chairs positioned to catch the afternoon light, even a vase of winter roses from the greenhouse. The effort he had made was touching, and it made what I had to do infinitely harder. He rose when I entered, his expression both pleased and concerned. "Eleanor," he said warmly, then more carefully, "you are feeling better? You look pale still. Should you be up?" The solicitude in his voice was my undoing. I sat before my legs could give out, and when he poured tea with his own hands rather than ringing for a servant, I realized this was meant to be private, intimate in the way our conversations had become, a space where we could be honest with each other. And I was about to repay his trust with a confession that would shatter everything. "I cannot drink that," I said quietly, looking at the teacup he held out. "The smell of it makes me ill." He set it down immediately, concern deepening. Should I ring for water instead? Or perhaps some light food? I shook my head, knowing I had to speak now before I lost my courage entirely. "Marcus," I said, using his given name for the first time, and his eyes widened slightly at the intimacy of it. "I need to tell you something that will change how you see me, and likely destroy whatever regard you have managed to develop. But I cannot keep it secret any longer. It is not fair to you, and it is not fair to myself to carry this burden alone." He set down his own cup slowly, his expression shifting to something more guarded. "Whatever it is," he said carefully, "we have promised honesty to each other. Tell me." "I am with child." The words fell between us like stones, and I watched him process them, saw the confusion that crossed his face first, then the growing realization of what I was actually saying. "But we have never," he began, then stopped, understanding arriving fully. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "The child is not yours," I confirmed, my voice barely above a whisper. "The conception occurred before our marriage, before I ever came here. I did not know when I married you. I did not realize until this week when the doctor confirmed it. I wanted to tell you immediately, but I did not know how to say it, how to explain. The silence that followed was crushing. I forced myself to look at him, to face whatever anger or disgust I would see there, but his expression was unreadable. He had gone very still. His hands gripped together so tightly his knuckles were white. "Tell me what happened," he said finally. And there was something dangerous in his voice, a cold fury I had never heard before. "Tell me who did this to you. Was it forced? Because if it was, I will find the man responsible and make him pay for it." The protective anger in his tone surprised me, but I shook my head quickly. "It was not force, not exactly," I said, then tried to find words for something I did not fully understand myself. "I was in London for the season, before my father fell ill. There was a man, Lord Pemberton, who paid me attentions. I thought he cared for me, thought he intended to offer marriage. I was young and stupid, and I believed his pretty words. One night he led me away from a ball, and I went willingly. I did not understand what he intended until it was happening, and by then I felt I could not refuse without making a scene, without ruining myself. So I did not refuse. And then he left London and never contacted me again, and I realized I had been nothing but a conquest to him, an amusement." "Lord Pemberton," the Duke repeated, and there was something lethal in the way he said the name. "Gerald Pemberton?" I nodded, and he laughed, a harsh sound without humor. Of course it was him. The man is a notorious libertine, known for seducing innocents and abandoning them. "And you were unprotected? Unchaperoned?" I felt shame burn through me at the accusation in his voice. My aunt was meant to be watching me, but she had gone to play cards. I thought I would be safe at a ball, surrounded by society. I did not know that danger could wear a gentleman's face and speak in educated tones. My voice broke on the last words, and I struggled to maintain composure. I know I was foolish. I know I should have known better, should have been more careful, but I cannot change what happened. I can only deal with the consequences. He stood abruptly and paced to the window, his back to me, and I waited for the condemnation I deserved. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with controlled emotion. "You are not the foolish one in this scenario, Eleanor. Pemberton is a predator who targeted you specifically because of your youth and inexperience. You were 17? 18? I nodded, though he could not see it. 18, barely out of the schoolroom. And he is what, 40? Old enough to know exactly what he was doing, experienced enough to manipulate you into a position where you felt you could not refuse. That is not seduction. That is calculated exploitation." I stared at his back, surprised by his words. I had expected anger directed at me, disappointment in my lack of virtue, perhaps even rejection. What I had not expected was this fury on my behalf, this clear-eyed assessment of what had actually happened. "But surely you must be angry with me," I said. "I am your wife, and I carry another man's child. That must disgust you." He turned then, and the expression on his face was complex, layered with emotions I could not fully read. "I am angry," he said, "but not with you. I am angry with Pemberton, with the society that allows men like him to prey on young women with impunity. I am angry with your aunt for her negligence, with the system that places the burden of virtue entirely on women while men are free to behave as they please. I am angry with your father for not protecting you better, though I suppose he never knew. But I am not angry with you, Eleanor. You were a victim of a practiced seducer, and nothing about that is your fault." The relief that flooded through me was so intense I felt dizzy. I had spent days convinced he would hate me, would cast me out, or at minimum withdraw into the cold distance of our early marriage. That he instead offered understanding, even protection, was more than I had dared hope for. "But what do we do now?" I asked. "Society will count the months. We'll know the child cannot be yours. The scandal will be enormous." He was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he returned to his chair and leaned forward, his expression intent. unless we ensure society believes otherwise. The marriage date could be slightly misremembered in official records. The pregnancy could be recorded as slightly premature. Women deliver early all the time. No one would question it, particularly if the child is small. We can control the narrative if we are careful. I stared at him, hardly daring to believe what he was suggesting. You would claim the child as yours? Raise it as your heir? Why would you do that? After everything my father did to you, after all the ways this marriage has been a burden, why would you take on this additional complication? His smile was sad, weary. Because I understand what it is to carry guilt for something that cannot be undone. Because I know what it is to be punished for a mistake, to have your entire life shaped by one terrible choice. This child is innocent, did nothing to deserve the stigma of illegitimacy, and you are innocent as well, regardless of what society would say. I have the power to protect you both, to give this child a name and a future. Why would I not use that power when I have spent so many years feeling powerless to make amends for anything? I felt tears slide down my cheeks, unable to stop them. You are a better man than anyone gives you credit for, I said. Than I gave you credit for when I first came here. He shook his head, rejecting the compliment. I am a man trying to do better than he has done in the past. That is all. But Eleanor, we will need to be very careful going forward. The deception must be complete. That means we must give society reason to believe the child is mine, which means our marriage must appear to have been consummated. Can you bear that? The pretense of intimacy when others are watching, even though we both know the truth? I nodded, wiping at my tears with shaking hands. I can bear anything if it means the child will be protected, if it means not facing this alone. He reached across the small space between us and took my hand, the first time he had touched me beyond the most formal of gestures. His hand was warm, strong, steady in a way that made me feel less like I was drowning. You are not alone, he said firmly. Whatever comes, we will face it together. That was our agreement, was it not? Honesty between us? We held to that even when it was difficult. This is simply another truth we must navigate together. The child will be an Ashford, will have every advantage and protection that name provides. And you will be safe here, as safe as I can make you. That night, lying in bed with my hand resting on my still flat stomach, I thought about the strange turns my life had taken. I had married a man I thought cold and cruel, discovered he was guilty of a terrible crime, learned he was also capable of great kindness and unexpected generosity. I had been betrayed by a man I thought I loved, and now protected by a man I was only beginning to understand. Nothing was as I had imagined it would be, and yet somehow I had found a kind of safety I had not expected. The following weeks brought changes to our routine. The Duke, Marcus, as I now called him in private, though still Your Grace in company, made it clear to the household staff that we were no longer to maintain separate wings. My belongings were moved to rooms adjoining his own, a suite connected by a door that remained unlocked though unopened. To outside observers, we appeared to be a normal married couple, sharing space and presumably intimacy. The reality was more complex, but no less significant. We were building something, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared secrets, and if it was not conventional, it was at least honest. He began teaching me about estate management, taking me with him on visits to tenants, and showing me the account books he kept so meticulously. You should understand how the property is run, he explained. If something happens to me, you will need to know these things, and the child, when he comes, will need to learn as well. I noted his use of he, the assumption that the baby would be a boy, and said nothing. It did not matter to me, but I knew it mattered to society, to the question of heirs and succession. We also began making preparations for the birth itself. A nursery was established on the floor above our rooms, decorated in soft colors that would suit either boy or girl. Marcus interviewed wet nurses and nannies with a thoroughness that surprised me, asking questions about their experience and philosophy of child rearing that went far beyond what most aristocratic fathers would concern themselves with. When I asked why he took such care, he said simply that the child deserved the best start possible, regardless of the circumstances of conception, that it was our responsibility now to ensure a good life. As my pregnancy became more visible, we began accepting social calls and even ventured into the village together, presenting a united front to the watching world. Marcus was attentive in public, his hand at my elbow, his concern for my comfort obvious. It was all performance, carefully calculated to establish the narrative we needed, but there were moments when the performance felt almost real. When he would catch me before I stumbled on uneven ground, or bring me a cushion without being asked, or simply stand close enough that I could feel his warmth and solidarity. In those moments, I felt something shift inside me, something that felt dangerously close to actual affection. One evening in early spring, with the baby due in just 2 months, he found me in the nursery standing before the cradle that had been brought down from the attics. It had been in the Ashford family for generations, he explained, rocking it gently with one hand. My sisters used it, and I as well. It seemed right to continue the tradition. I watched him touch the carved wood, saw the unexpected tenderness in the gesture, and felt my throat tighten with emotion. "Marcus," I said quietly, "why are you doing all this? Not just claiming the child, but all of it. The nursery, the preparation, the way you speak about the baby as if it truly matters to you." He was silent for a moment, his hand stilling on the cradle's edge. "Perhaps because it is the first truly good thing I have had the opportunity to do in a very long time," he said finally. "Since Richard died, I have lived with guilt as my constant companion. Every action has been shadowed by what I did, by what I failed to do. But this child offers something different. A chance to be better, to protect rather than harm, to build rather than destroy. That matters to me more than I can easily express." I moved to stand beside him, looking down at the empty cradle that would soon hold new life. "You have already been better," I said softly. "You have protected me when you did not have to, been kind when it would have been easier to be cruel. That counts for something." He looked at me then, really looked, and there was something in his eyes I had not seen before. Something warm and wondering and almost vulnerable. "You make it sound simple," he said, his voice rough. "As if kindness cancels out killing a man, as if protecting you now somehow balances leaving your uncle to die. It does not work that way, Eleanor. The guilt does not disappear just because I do better things now." I shook my head, reaching out to touch his arm, a gesture that had become more natural between us in recent weeks. "No, it does not disappear," I agreed. "But perhaps it can be transformed into something more useful than self-punishment. Perhaps the guilt can drive you to be the man you wish you had been then. That is what you are doing, whether you recognize it or not. You are becoming someone worthy of forgiveness, even if you cannot forgive yourself." His hand covered mine where it rested on his arm, warm and solid and real. "When did you become so wise?" he asked, and there was a hint of humor in his voice, but also genuine curiosity. "When I had no choice but to understand complicated truths," I replied. "When I learned that people are not simply good or bad, but capable of both great harm and great kindness, sometimes in the same breath. You taught me that, Marcus. You and this impossible situation we find ourselves in. We stood there together in the gathering dusk, hands touching, looking at the cradle that represented both our pasts and our uncertain future. It was one of those moments that felt suspended in time, fragile and precious and utterly unexpected. I thought about the girl I had been arriving at Ashford Hall just months ago, terrified and alone and convinced her life was over. That girl would not have believed this moment possible, standing beside her husband, not in love perhaps, but in something equally valuable, preparing together for a child that would bind them in ways neither had anticipated. The weeks that followed were among the most peaceful I had known since my father's death. My pregnancy progressed normally, and Marcus was unfailingly attentive, checking on me constantly, adjusting our plans to accommodate my increasing discomfort. He read to me in the evenings, everything from novels to agricultural reports, his voice steady and soothing. We played chess, a game I had loved as a child, and he let me win more often than was strictly fair. We talked about everything and nothing, comfortable in each other's presence in a way that felt miraculous given where we had started. But peace never lasts forever, and ours was shattered one afternoon in late April when a visitor arrived unannounced. I was resting in the morning room, my feet elevated as the doctor had recommended, when Mrs. Blackwood entered with an expression of extreme disapproval. "Lord Pemberton, to see his grace," she announced in tones that suggested she would rather announce the plague. "He is waiting in the blue drawing room." I felt the blood drain from my face. Pemberton. Here. After months of silence, after I had convinced myself I would never see him again, he had appeared at Ashford Hall. Why? What could he possibly want? Marcus, who had been reading correspondence at his desk, looked up sharply. He saw my expression and was at my side immediately. "Eleanor, what is it? What is wrong?" I could not speak, could only shake my head, but he understood. He had always been quick to read me, a skill that had developed over our months together. "Pemberton," he said, and it was not a question. I nodded, and his face went absolutely rigid with controlled fury. "Stay here," he commanded. "Do not come out until I return for you." He strode from the room, his bearing martial, and I heard his boots echo through the corridors as he went to confront the man who had ruined me. I wanted to follow, wanted to be present for whatever confrontation was about to occur, but my body would not cooperate. I felt frozen, trapped in the chair, my heart hammering so hard I feared for the baby. What could Pemberton want? Money? To claim the child? The very thought made me ill. Time crawled. I heard voices raised in the distance, the low rumble of male anger, but could not make out words. Mrs. Blackwood appeared briefly to bring me water, her face carefully neutral, though I saw concern in her eyes. She knows, I realized. Somehow the housekeeper had pieced together the truth, or at least part of it. How many others in the household suspected? How long before the whispers started, before society began to question and investigate? When Marcus finally returned, perhaps 30 minutes later though it felt like hours, his face was pale with rage barely held in check. He came directly to me, kneeling beside my chair so we were at eye level. "Are you all right?" he asked first, and I nodded, though it was not entirely true. What did he want? I forced myself to ask, dreading the answer. "Money," Marcus said bluntly. "The man is apparently deep in debt, facing ruin, and he somehow learned of your marriage to me. He came here to demand payment for his silence, threatening to spread word that the child you carry is his unless I give him what he asks. The effrontery of it would be amusing if it were not so vile." I felt sick. So he knows about the baby, knows he could destroy us with a word. Marcus gripped my hands tightly. "He knows nothing that matters," he said firmly. "He suspects because he learned you married shortly after your time in London and has done the mathematics. But suspicion is not proof, and his reputation is such that no one would believe him without evidence. I have made it very clear that if he speaks one word of this to anyone, I will destroy him utterly. I have connections he cannot match, resources he cannot comprehend, and I have no moral compunctions about using every bit of power at my disposal to protect my family." "What if he does not care about your threats?" I asked. "What if desperation makes him reckless?" Marcus smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a man who had spent years learning exactly how to wield power, and who had finally found a cause worthy of that knowledge. "Then I will ruin him anyway, for the pleasure of it," he said simply. I will see him stripped of his lands, his title made worthless, his name become synonymous with disgrace. I promised him as much, in terms he could not misunderstand. He left here knowing that any move against us would be the last free act of his life. Pemberton is a coward, Eleanor. Bullies always are. He will slink back to London and look for easier prey, someone without the protection you now have. I wanted to believe him, wanted to feel safe in the assurance of his threats. But I had learned that nothing was ever truly certain, that safety was always provisional. Still, watching him kneel beside me, seeing the fierce protectiveness in his eyes, I felt something loosen in my chest. Whatever came, I would not face it alone. That had to count for something. The incident with Pemberton cast a shadow over the remaining weeks of my pregnancy, though Marcus did everything in his power to ease my fears. He hired additional staff for the house, men whose bearing suggested military backgrounds and whose presence was clearly meant as security. He made inquiries in London, keeping tabs on Pemberton's movements and financial situation. And he rarely left my side, abandoning his study and his estate work to remain close, as if his physical presence could ward off any threat. In truth, I think he needed the proximity as much as I did. The confrontation had shaken him, brought back all his protective instincts and his capacity for violence in defense of those he cared for. I saw it in the way his hands would clench when he thought I was not looking, in the nightmares that sometimes woke him in the hours before dawn. He had told Pemberton he would destroy him, and I believed utterly that he meant it, would follow through without hesitation if threatened. It was frightening in its intensity, but also strangely comforting. I had never had someone willing to fight for me before, willing to use every resource at their disposal for my protection. The baby came in early May, on a morning when apple blossoms drifted past the windows like snow and the moors were bright with spring flowers. The labor was long and difficult, hours of pain that blurred together into one endless moment of struggle. Marcus stayed with me throughout, which was highly unconventional, but I had begged him not to leave, and he had agreed without hesitation. He held my hand, brought cool cloths for my forehead, whispered encouragement when I wanted to give up. And when the baby finally arrived, a girl with dark hair and eyes that seemed to look through me with ancient wisdom, he was the first to hold her after the midwife had checked her breathing. "She is perfect," he said softly, wonder in his voice as he looked down at the tiny face. "Absolutely perfect." He brought her to me, placing her carefully in my arms, and I felt my heart crack open at the sight of her. My daughter. Born from a moment of youthful foolishness, carried through months of fear and uncertainty, but here now, real and alive and miraculous. I looked up at Marcus, seeing tears on his face that he made no effort to hide, and felt gratitude so intense it was almost painful. "Thank you," I whispered, not trusting my voice for more, for everything, for claiming her, for protecting us, for being here. He leaned down and kissed my forehead, a gesture of such tenderness it stole what remained of my breath. "No thanks needed," he murmured. "She is ours now, Eleanor, yours and mine. Whatever her origins, she belongs to us, and we will love her and protect her for all of our days." I believed him. In that moment, holding my daughter while my husband watched over us both, I believed every word. We had built something unexpected from the ruins of tragedy and betrayal. Not a conventional marriage, perhaps, but something that felt solid and real and worth fighting for. And as I looked at my daughter's face, at the future now opening before us, I felt something I had not experienced in a very long time. I felt hope. We named her Catherine, after Marcus's mother, and she became the center of our world in ways neither of us had anticipated. I had expected the demands of new motherhood, the sleepless nights and constant feeding, the fear that accompanied every small cry or moment of stillness. What I had not expected was how completely she would transform the atmosphere of Ashford Hall, bringing light and warmth to rooms that had seemed permanently shadowed. And I had not expected the transformation in Marcus himself, the way fatherhood seemed to unlock some carefully guarded part of his heart. He was devoted to her from the first moment, spending hours in the nursery when he should have been attending to estate business. I would find him standing over her cradle at odd hours, simply watching her sleep with an expression of wonder on his face. He learned to hold her properly, to soothe her when she cried, to make her laugh with silly faces that destroyed his usual dignified demeanor. The servants whispered about it, this duke who behaved more like a besotted grandfather than an aristocratic father. But he did not care. Nothing mattered except Catherine's well-being and happiness. For my part, I fell into motherhood with a desperation born of love and fear in equal measure. Every moment with Catherine felt precious and fragile, shadowed by the knowledge of how easily she could have been lost to scandal and disgrace. When I nursed her, feeling the pull of her feeding and the weight of her small body in my arms, I would think about Pemberton and what he had taken from me, but also about Marcus and what he had given. Catherine would never know the circumstances of her conception. She would grow up knowing only love and security, believing herself the legitimate daughter of the Duke and Duchess of Ashford. That gift was beyond price. The first months passed in a blur of infant care and adjustment. We established routines, Marcus and I working together to ensure Catherine's needs were met while also maintaining the household and estate. We had become partners in truth, united by our shared love for this child and by the growing respect we had developed for each other. There were still difficult moments, times when the past would rise up between us like a specter. I would see him looking at Catherine with an expression I could not quite read, and wonder if he saw Pemberton in her features, if her existence reminded him daily of my failure. But when I voiced these fears, he was adamant in his denial. "She is my daughter," he would say firmly, "mine in every way that matters. Her biological origins are an accident of circumstance, nothing more. I love her, Eleanor, completely and without reservation. Please believe that." And I did believe it, because I saw the evidence in every interaction, every tender moment, every instance of fierce protectiveness. Marcus loved Catherine as deeply as any father could, perhaps more deeply because he understood how close she had come to a very different fate. As Catherine grew from newborn to infant, becoming more aware and responsive, she began to show her personality. She was a serious baby, watchful and careful, but when she smiled, it was like the sun breaking through clouds. She had my coloring, but Pemberton's features, a combination that occasionally made my heart clench with complicated emotions. But she also had something entirely her own, a quality of determination and strength that I like to think came from having survived against all odds. She was a fighter, our Catherine, and I was fiercely proud of her. The outside world intruded occasionally on our domestic peace. We received visits from Marcus's sisters, curious to meet the niece they had not known was coming. They were kind to me, if somewhat reserved, clearly uncertain about their brother's sudden marriage and quick production of an heir. I navigated these visits carefully, conscious always of the story we were maintaining, the careful timeline we had constructed. To all outward appearances, Catherine had been conceived on our wedding night or shortly after, born slightly early but healthy. No one questioned it openly, though I sometimes caught speculative glances and whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room. More difficult were the social obligations that came with our position. As Duchess of Ashford, I was expected to host dinners and attend local assemblies to be seen and known by the community. Marcus had shielded me from most of this during my pregnancy, but now that Catherine was born and I had recovered, he could no longer justify keeping me isolated. So we began to venture out, presenting ourselves as the happily married couple, doting parents to a beautiful daughter. It was exhausting, the constant performance, but also necessary. Our position depended on appearances, and appearances required careful cultivation. One evening at a dinner party hosted by a neighboring family, I overheard a conversation that chilled my blood. Two matrons were speaking in low voices, unaware I was seated just behind a decorative screen in the drawing room. "The Duchess seems devoted to the child," one said. "But there is something odd about the timing, do you not think? Married in November, baby born in May. That is barely 6 months." The other woman made a dismissive sound. "Babies come early all the time, especially first ones, and the Duke acknowledges her, presents her as his legitimate heir. That is all that matters in the end." Still, the first woman persisted. "One hears things. About the Duchess's time in London before her marriage, about a certain lord known for seducing innocents." I barely made it from the room before my composure shattered. Marcus found me in a side parlor, shaking with the effort of not crying, and demanded to know what had happened. When I told him, his face went dark with fury. "Who were they?" he asked, his voice dangerous. I shook my head, unwilling to name them, knowing it would only make things worse. "It does not matter," I said. "They only spoke aloud what others must be thinking. Perhaps we were foolish to believe we could control the narrative completely. Society loves nothing more than a scandal, and we have given them all the pieces even if they cannot quite fit them together." Marcus pulled me into his arms, a gesture that had become more common between us but still held the power to surprise me. "Listen to me," he said fiercely. "Those women are nothing. Their opinions mean nothing. Catherine is legally and legitimately our daughter. Anyone who questions that questions my word, and I will not tolerate such disrespect. We will weather this gossip as we have weathered everything else together." His certainty steadied me, as it always did. I leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of him, and tried to believe we would be all right. But the incident had shaken me, reminded me that our peace was built on a foundation of lies that could crack at any moment. That night, unable to sleep, I found myself in the library where this had all begun, standing before the shelf where Marcus kept his diaries. I had not read them in months, not since before Catherine's birth, but now I pulled down the most recent volume and flipped to the current year's entries. What I found there made my breath catch. Catherine laughed today, truly laughed, a sound of pure joy that seemed to light the whole room. I find myself unable to remember what my life was like before her, before Eleanor. The guilt over Richard is still there, will always be there, but it no longer defines every moment. I have found something worth living for beyond mere penance, something worth protecting with everything I am. They are my family, truly mine, and I will let no one threaten them. Not gossips, not Pemberton, not the past itself. I have failed at so many things in my life, but I will not fail at this. Further back, an entry from shortly after Catherine's birth. I held my daughter today and felt something shift inside me, some wall I had built around my heart crumble to dust. I love her. The realization is both wonderful and terrifying. I have not let myself love anyone since Richard died, have not trusted myself with that kind of vulnerability. But Catherine has broken through every defense without even trying, and I find I do not want to rebuild them. Eleanor has given me this gift, whether she realizes it or not, the chance to be more than my worst moment, to be someone worthy of love even if I do not deserve it. And earlier still, just after our conversation about honesty, Eleanor knows the truth now, and instead of the hatred I expected, she offers understanding. Forgiveness, perhaps, though I dare not presume so much. I do not know what I have done to deserve her mercy, but I will spend whatever time I have trying to be worthy of it. She is remarkable, this woman I married under such terrible circumstances. Strong and kind and far wiser than her years suggest. I find myself wanting things I thought forever beyond my reach. Not just her acceptance, but her regard, her friendship. Perhaps given time. Even more than that. I closed the diary carefully, my hands trembling. He loved Catherine. That much was clear from every word. But these other feelings he described, these growing attachments and hopes, what did they mean? And how did I feel about them? I examined my own heart, testing the waters of my emotions as one might test ice, carefully and with full awareness of the danger beneath. What I found surprised me. Somewhere in the months of living together, of building this partnership and raising Catherine, of shared confidences and growing trust, I had developed feelings for Marcus that went far beyond gratitude or respect. I cared for him, truly cared, in a way that made my heart race when he entered a room and made me miss him when he was away. Was it love? I did not know. I had thought myself in love with Pemberton once, and that had been nothing but illusion and manipulation. How could I trust my own feelings after being so catastrophically wrong before? But this felt different. What I felt for Marcus was built on knowledge rather than fantasy, on seeing him at his worst and his best and choosing to value him anyway. It was built on the small intimacies of daily life, on watching him cradle our daughter with infinite tenderness, on the way he made me tea without asking, on conversations that ranged from trivial to profound. It was built on trust, hard-won and carefully maintained, and on the growing certainty that he would never willingly hurt me, would protect me against any threat even at cost to himself. That was not the infatuation of a naive girl for a charming rake. That was something deeper, more real, and infinitely more frightening, because now I had something genuine to lose. The question was what to do about it. Our marriage was built on a foundation of tragedy and necessity, not love. We had never spoken of romantic feelings, had carefully maintained a boundary between the partnership we had built and anything more intimate. To cross that boundary now felt risky, potentially devastating if my feelings were not reciprocated, or if Marcus felt obligated to pretend feelings he did not have. Better perhaps to leave things as they were, to be grateful for the friendship we had achieved and not reach for more. But the human heart is not always reasonable, and mine had already made its choice, whether I willed it or not. Summer arrived, and with it came the first anniversary of my arrival at Ashford Hall. Marcus marked the occasion with a gift, a delicate locket containing a miniature portrait of Catherine. I was touched by the thoughtfulness, but also aware of what the date represented. A year of this strange marriage, this unexpected family we had built from impossible circumstances. "We have survived a year," he said, with a smile that held both pride and wonder. "That is something to celebrate, I think." I agreed, though privately I thought survival was too weak a word for what we had achieved. We had not merely survived, but flourished in our own way, creating something good from the wreckage of the past. That evening, after Catherine had been put to bed and the house had settled into nighttime quiet, I found Marcus in his study, as had become my habit. We often spent an hour or two together before retiring, talking or reading, simply enjoying each other's company. But tonight felt different, charged with something I could not quite name. Perhaps it was the significance of the date, or perhaps it was simply that I had reached the limits of what I could keep unspoken. I had never been good at hiding my feelings, and a year of intimacy had eroded what little skill I possessed at dissembling. "Marcus," I said, and he looked up from the correspondence he had been reviewing. "There is something I need to say to you, something that has been growing for some time now, and I find I cannot keep silent about it any longer." He set down his pen, giving me his full attention, and I saw wariness enter his expression. He thought I was going to tell him something bad, I realized. That was where his mind went first, to problems and threats rather than possibilities. It broke my heart a little, this evidence of how deeply his guilt had shaped his expectations. "I love you," I said simply, deciding there was no point in elaborate preambles or careful explanations. "I am in love with you, have been for some time, though I have only recently admitted it to myself. I do not expect you to return the feeling, and I do not want you to feel obligated to pretend emotions you do not have. But we promised each other honesty, and this is my truth. You have become essential to me, Marcus, not just as a protector or provider, but as the person I most want to talk to, most want to be near. I love who you are when you hold Catherine, the fierce way you protect those you care about, your intelligence and dry humor and capacity for growth. I love you, and I needed you to know that. The silence that followed was agonizing. He stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language, his expression unreadable. I began to regret my impulsive confession, to wish I had kept my feelings hidden where they could not complicate our careful balance. But then he stood and crossed to where I sat, kneeling before me much as he had when I told him about the pregnancy. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "Do you truly mean that? You love me? After everything I have done, everything you know about me, you can feel that way?" I reached out to touch his face, the first time I had ever done so, feeling the slight rasp of his evening beard beneath my fingers. "I love you because of everything I know about you," I said. "Not in spite of it. I love that you have spent 10 years trying to atone for a single terrible mistake. I love that you protected Catherine and me when you could have made our lives miserable. I love the man you have become through pain and guilt and the choice to be better. Yes, Marcus, I truly mean it." He closed his eyes, leaning into my touch as if it were a benediction he had not known he needed. "I have loved you for months," he said quietly. "Since before Catherine was born, perhaps since that first night when you confronted me about the diaries and offered me truce instead of hatred. I have loved you and not dared to speak of it, because I could not believe you would ever feel the same. Could not imagine that you would see past what I did to your uncle, past the forced nature of our marriage, to anything worth loving. I thought the best I could hope for was your tolerance, your willingness to coexist peacefully. To learn that you feel more than that you actually love me, is more than I ever dreamed possible." I pulled him up to sit beside me, our hands clasped together, and felt tears slide down my cheeks. "We have both been fools then," I said with a shaky laugh, "loving each other in silence, too afraid to speak, too convinced the other could never feel the same. How much time have we wasted?" He wiped my tears away gently, his touch reverent. "Perhaps not wasted," he suggested. "Perhaps we needed that time to build the foundation we have now, to learn to trust each other, to become partners before we could become more. I would not trade these months for anything, Eleanor. They have made us who we are, together." That night marked another beginning for us, a shift from the partnership we had carefully constructed to something deeper and more intimate. We did not rush into physical intimacy, that would come later, with time and patience and the gradual erosion of the last walls between us. But the emotional intimacy that had been building for months could now be acknowledged and celebrated rather than hidden. We could speak of love, could let our touches linger, could look at each other with open affection rather than carefully guarded regard. It was a relief so profound I had not realized how much energy I had been spending on restraint until I no longer needed to. The household noticed the change, of course. Servants whispered about how the Duke and Duchess could often be seen walking hand in hand in the gardens, how they would sit close together at dinner rather than at opposite ends of the table, how they looked at each other with obvious warmth and affection. Mrs. Blackwood permitted herself a small smile when she thought no one was watching, and even the stern housekeeper seemed pleased by this development. "The master deserves happiness," I heard her tell Mary one day. "God knows he has punished himself enough for one mistake. If her grace can help him find peace, then it is a blessing for this house." Catherine grew through that summer and into autumn, becoming more alert and active with each passing week. She began to recognize us, her face lighting up when Marcus or I entered the room. She reached for us with grasping hands, made babbling sounds that we pretended were words, filled our days with wonder and exhaustion in equal measure. And watching Marcus with her, seeing the absolute devotion in his face, I fell in love with him all over again. He was the father I wished I had had for myself, patient and present and endlessly gentle. Whatever sins he had committed in the past, he was redeeming them every day through his love for our daughter. But the past, as I had learned, never truly releases its hold. In late autumn, A letter arrived that threatened to shatter the peace we had built. It was from Pemberton's solicitor, informing us that Lord Pemberton had died of a fever contracted during a trip abroad. The letter was formally correct, offering condolences for the loss of an acquaintance, but it also contained a barely veiled threat. Lord Pemberton's affairs are being settled, the solicitor wrote, and certain letters and documents have come to light which may be of interest to the Duke of Ashford. I will be calling upon you next week to discuss the disposition of these materials. Marcus's face was grim when he showed me the letter. Blackmail, he said flatly. Pemberton must have kept some record of his conquest, letters perhaps, or a diary entry, something that proves or strongly suggests Catherine's parentage. Now his solicitor sees an opportunity to profit from that information. I felt cold dread settle in my stomach. After all this time, after everything we had built, was it all going to collapse because a dead man had been foolish enough to document his crimes? What do we do? I asked. We meet with the solicitor, Marcus said. We hear what he has to offer, and then we decide how to respond. But Eleanor, you must understand something. I will not let this destroy us. Will not let some grasping lawyer use Catherine against us. Whatever it costs, whatever I have to do, I will protect our family. The determination in his voice steadied me, but I could not shake the fear that had taken root. How did one fight shadows and implications? How did we prove Catherine was legitimate when we both knew she was not? The solicitor arrived the following week, a thin man with calculating eyes and an obsequious manner that poorly disguised his avarice. Mr. Thornton, he introduced himself. I appreciate you receiving me on such short notice, Your Grace. He produced a leather case from which he extracted several letters, all in Pemberton's hand. I have here correspondence that suggests Lord Pemberton had relations with a young lady in London during the previous season, he said delicately, a lady who then married rather precipitously to the Duke of Ashford. The timing is quite interesting, you must admit. Marcus's face could have been carved from stone. What exactly are you implying, Mr. Thornton? And more importantly, what is it you want? The solicitor had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, but pressed on. Lord Pemberton's debts are considerable, Your Grace. His estate cannot cover them. However, if a certain sum were to be paid to his creditors, these letters could be destroyed, the matter forgotten entirely. Call it a settlement for services rendered, or simple charity to a deceased peer. The terminology matters less than the outcome. I felt sick, but Marcus merely raised an eyebrow. You are asking me to pay Lord Pemberton's debts in exchange for letters that may or may not contain anything relevant to my family. That sounds remarkably like blackmail, Mr. Thornton. Blackmail is illegal, as I am sure you are aware, being a man of law. The solicitor paled slightly, but held his ground. I merely present options, Your Grace. What you choose to do with them is entirely your decision. Of course, if these letters were to become public, if they were to be discussed in certain circles, the implications for the Duchess and for young Lady Catherine could be unfortunate. Society can be so cruel in its judgments, particularly toward women and children. It would be a shame if such innocent parties were to suffer due to the indiscretions of the past. Marcus stood slowly, and there was something in his bearing that made the solicitor take an involuntary step backward. Mr. Thornton, Marcus said, his voice deadly quiet, you have made a serious miscalculation today. You have come into my home and threatened my wife and daughter. You have attempted to extort money from me using information obtained from a dead man who was himself a criminal. And you seem to believe I will simply pay you to maintain my family's reputation. Allow me to correct your assumptions. He moved around the desk, and the solicitor actually backed toward the door. I am the Duke of Ashford, Marcus continued. My family has held power in this region for 300 years. I have connections that reach to the highest levels of society and government. I have resources you cannot begin to imagine and a willingness to use them all to protect what is mine. If you attempt to make those letters public, I will destroy you so completely that your name will become a byword for foolishness and greed. I will see you disbarred, your practice dismantled, your reputation shattered beyond any hope of repair. And then, just for the satisfaction of it, I will purchase Pemberton's debts myself and ensure his creditors are paid in full, rendering your leverage entirely worthless. Do you understand me, Mr. Thornton? The solicitor's face had gone white. Your Grace, I merely sought to, he began. But Marcus cut him off with a gesture. You sought to profit from tragedy and exploit the vulnerability of innocent parties. You failed. Now leave my house, and if I hear so much as a whisper of those letters or their contents anywhere in society, I will know exactly where to direct my vengeance. The solicitor fled, leaving the letters scattered on the desk, and Marcus stood staring after him for a long moment before turning to me. I am sorry you had to witness that, he said quietly. But I meant every word. No one threatens our family and escapes consequence. I went to him, wrapping my arms around him and feeling his heart pounding beneath my cheek. You were magnificent, I said, and terrifying, and absolutely right. But Marcus, what if he does speak despite your threats? What if the scandal breaks anyway? He held me tightly, his chin resting on top of my head. Then we will face it together, as we have faced everything else. But I do not think he will speak, Eleanor. Men like Thornton are fundamentally cowards. They operate in shadows and implications because they lack the courage for direct confrontation. I have dragged him into the light and shown him exactly what he faces. He will slink away and find easier prey. And we will continue with our lives, loving each other and raising our daughter and refusing to let the past have power over our present. He was right, as it turned out. We heard nothing more from Thornton or about Pemberton's letters. Whatever documents existed were apparently destroyed or lost, and the potential scandal faded before it ever truly materialized. Life returned to normal, or what passed for normal in our unconventional household. We continued building our family, continued growing closer with each passing day, continued discovering new depths to the love we had found in such unexpected circumstances. 2 years passed, years filled with the ordinary joys and challenges that make up a life. Catherine grew from infant to toddler, learning to walk and then to run, filling Ashford Hall with laughter and chaos that the old house seemed to welcome after so many years of silence. She was bright and curious, constantly exploring, constantly asking questions in her developing vocabulary. Why is the sky blue? Where do the birds go at night? Why does Papa have to work? Marcus and I answered as best we could, delighting in her wonder at the world, amazed daily by the little person she was becoming. Our marriage deepened into something I had never imagined possible. The physical intimacy that had developed slowly and carefully between us was tender and passionate by turns, built on trust and genuine desire rather than duty or obligation. We shared a bed now, shared our days and nights, shared everything with a completeness that felt miraculous given where we had started. Sometimes I would wake in the early morning light and find Marcus already awake, watching me with such obvious love in his eyes that it took my breath away. How did I become so fortunate? I would think. How did this man who seemed so cold and distant become the center of my world? We had grown comfortable in our life together, settled into routines that felt both familiar and precious. Mornings with Catherine, teaching her letters and numbers, walking in the gardens. Afternoons when Marcus would return from inspecting the estate and we would take tea together, discussing everything from tenants' concerns to political developments. Evenings when we would dine together, then retire to the library or drawing room, sometimes with Catherine playing at our feet until bedtime, sometimes alone when she was already sleeping. It was a good life, a peaceful life, and I treasured it precisely because I knew how easily it might never have existed. But the past, no matter how firmly we believed we had buried it, had one final revelation waiting. It came in the form of a letter from my father's solicitor, delivered on a gray November morning that felt heavy with premonition. Mrs. Blackwood brought it to me while I was supervising Catherine's breakfast, and something in the housekeeper's expression made me open it immediately, despite the sticky jam prints Catherine was determined to leave on everything within reach. The letter was formal, explaining that in the process of finalizing my father's estate, they had discovered a locked box among his papers marked with instructions that it be delivered to me personally 2 years after his death. That date had now arrived, and they were sending the box by special courier. It would arrive within the week. I stared at the words, feeling cold dread settle in my stomach. What could my father possibly have left for me that required such specific timing? What final manipulation or revelation was waiting in that locked box? Marcus found me still sitting at the breakfast table, long after Catherine had been taken to the nursery, the letter clutched in my hand. He read it over my shoulder and then pulled up a chair beside me. "Whatever it contains, we will face it together," he said quietly. "Your father cannot hurt us now, Eleanor. He is gone, and we have built something too strong to be shaken by messages from beyond the grave." I wanted to believe him, but I could not shake the feeling that my father had orchestrated one final move in his long game of revenge and manipulation. The box arrived 3 days later, small and wooden, bound with leather straps and secured with a lock whose key had been enclosed in the solicitor's letter. I carried it to Marcus's study, and we sat together before the fire, neither of us quite ready to open it. Finally, Marcus took the key from my hand. "Would you like me to open it first?" he asked gently. "To see what is inside before you have to?" I shook my head. "No," I said. "We should do this together." He unlocked the box, and inside we found papers, carefully arranged and labeled in my father's precise handwriting. The first document was a letter addressed to me in my father's hand. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, and I felt tears prick my eyes at seeing those familiar words one more time. "If you are reading this, then 2 years have passed since my death, and I hope you have found some measure of happiness in your marriage to the Duke of Ashford. I know you must think me cruel for forcing this union upon you, and perhaps I was. But I ask you now to read what follows with an open mind, and to understand that everything I did was motivated by love for you, twisted though my methods may have been." We read on, Marcus's hand tight around mine. What followed was a confession and an explanation that turned everything I thought I understood upside down. My father had indeed discovered the truth about Uncle Richard's death, but not through witnesses or overheard confessions as I had assumed. He had discovered it because he had been there that night, had been staying at the same country house, had seen the racing and followed at a distance, worried for his brother's safety. He had watched the accident happen, had seen Marcus ride away, and had reached his brother's side just in time to hear his final words. "Richard had not died immediately," my father wrote. "He lived for perhaps 10 minutes after I reached him, long enough to speak, to ask me not to seek revenge on the Duke. He said the racing had been his idea as much as Ashford's, that they had both been drunk and foolish, that it was an accident born of arrogance rather than malice. He made me promise, Eleanor, promise that I would not pursue justice through conventional means, would not see Ashford hanged or imprisoned for what was ultimately a tragic mistake. I gave that promise to ease his dying moments, but I could not keep it entirely. I could not simply let Ashford escape all consequence, could not forget what I had seen." The letter continued, explaining the years of watching Marcus, of seeing him punish himself more thoroughly than any court could have done, of observing his withdrawal from society and his dedication to being a better man. My father had struggled with his promise to Uncle Richard and his own desire for justice, and had ultimately crafted his plan as a compromise between the two. He would force Marcus to marry me, but not out of simple revenge. He had researched Marcus thoroughly, had satisfied himself that despite his past mistake, the Duke was fundamentally a good man who would treat me well, who would protect and provide for me. And he had believed, or perhaps hoped, that we might find happiness together despite the forced nature of the match. "I did not want you to know the truth while I lived," my father wrote, "because I feared you would refuse the marriage if you understood all the circumstances. But 2 years should have been enough time for you to see Ashford's true character, to build a relationship with him based on who he actually is, rather than his worst moment. I hope I was right, Eleanor. I hope you have found love where I offered only duty, found partnership where I imposed obligation. I hope you can forgive an old man who loved his daughter too much, and his brother's memory just enough to make choices that seemed cruel, but which I believed were right. There was more in the box. A full account of the accident from my father's perspective, corroborating everything Marcus had written in his diaries. Letters Marcus had sent my father over the years, apologizing for Richard's death, offering financial support for our family, trying in whatever small ways he could to make amends. My father had kept everyone, had apparently responded to some, had maintained a correspondence with Marcus I had never known existed. And finally, there was a letter Marcus had written to my father shortly before the wedding, one that made my throat tight with emotion. "I will care for your daughter, as she deserves," Marcus had written. "I know I can never make amends for taking your brother from you, but I swear on everything I hold sacred that Eleanor will want for nothing. I will protect her, provide for her, and do everything in my power to make her happy. If you are reading this after your death as you indicated, please know that I will honor our agreement in spirit as well as letter. Your daughter will be safe with me, always. She will be loved, even if she can never love me in return. This, I promise you." I looked up at Marcus, seeing tears on his face that matched my own. "You wrote this before we married," I said. "Before you even knew me, you promised to love me?" He nodded, his voice rough when he spoke. "Your father was dying, and he was entrusting his only child to a man he had every reason to hate. The least I could do was promise to be worthy of that trust, even though I did not believe I ever could be. I thought I would spend my life trying to be the husband you deserved and always falling short. I never imagined you would actually come to love me, that we would build something real and true together." I set aside the letters and moved to sit in his lap, wrapping my arms around him and holding tight. My father was a manipulative, controlling man who played games with people's lives, I said. But he was also perceptive enough to see what I could not. That you were someone worth knowing, worth loving, worth building a life with. He forced us together, yes, but he also gave us the chance to discover what we could become to each other. I cannot forgive all his methods, but I can be grateful for the outcome. Marcus buried his face in my hair, his arms tight around me. "I have loved you for so long," he murmured. "Loved you and feared that love because I did not believe I deserved it. Your father's letter, his belief that we could find happiness together, it feels like a kind of absolution I did not know I needed. As if he is giving permission from beyond the grave for me to be happy, to love you without the weight of guilt, making me question whether I have the right." We sat like that for a long time, holding each other while the fire burned low and the afternoon light faded outside the windows. There was a strange peace in finally understanding the full story, in seeing how many threads had woven together to bring us to this moment. My father's love and his anger, his promises to his dying brother and his inability to fully keep them, Marcus's guilt and his determination to atone, my own youthful mistakes and the unexpected grace I had received. All of it had led here, to this moment, to this embrace, to the family we had built from such complicated and painful beginnings. That evening, after we had composed ourselves and returned to our normal routine, we told Catherine a story at bedtime about a duke who made a terrible mistake and spent many years trying to be better, and a young woman who showed him that redemption was possible through love and forgiveness. She was too young to understand the real meaning behind the tale, but she listened with wide eyes and asked if the duke and the lady lived happily ever after. "Yes," I told her, kissing her forehead as Marcus tucked the blankets around her small form. They did. They found their happy ending, even though the beginning was very hard. Later, in our own room, Marcus and I talked long into the night about my father's revelations. We discussed whether we should tell Catherine the full truth when she was older, or whether the story of her origins could remain forever buried. We decided we would wait, would let her grow up secure in her identity as our daughter, and only tell her the complicated truth if circumstances ever made it necessary. She deserved a childhood unmarred by scandal or secrets, deserved to simply be loved without qualification or caveat. We also talked about Uncle Richard, about the young man I had never known, who had apparently been kind enough in his final moments to ask for mercy for the friend who had inadvertently killed him. There was something profound in that, something that spoke to the possibility of grace, even in the darkest circumstances. If Richard could forgive from his deathbed, if my father could craft his revenge into something that ultimately brought happiness rather than destruction, then perhaps we could finally release the last vestiges of guilt and embrace fully the life we had built. The months that followed were marked by a lightness I had not experienced before. It was as if my father's letter had lifted some final weight we had been carrying without realizing it. Marcus smiled more easily, laughed more freely, allowed himself the full expression of the joy he found in our family. And I felt a security I had not known was missing, the certainty that our marriage had been blessed in a strange way by the very man who had forced it into being. He had known what he was doing, had seen possibilities we could not, and in his twisted way had given us exactly what we needed. Catherine thrived in the atmosphere of unconditional love we provided. She was a happy child, secure in her world, showing no signs of the trauma that might have marked her if circumstances had been different. When I watched her play, when I saw Marcus lift her onto his shoulders and carry her through the gardens while she shrieked with delight, I thought about how close we had all come to a very different existence. If my father had not blackmailed Marcus into marriage, if Marcus had not chosen to protect me and claim Catherine, if we had not both been willing to build something from the ruins we were given, none of this would exist. We owed our happiness to choices made in pain and anger, transmuted over time into something precious. Spring came again, bringing with it the 3rd anniversary of my arrival at Ashford Hall. Marcus surprised me by arranging a small celebration, inviting his sisters and their families, some local gentry we had become friendly with, and creating an afternoon of warmth and fellowship. It was the first time we had entertained on such a scale, and I was nervous about it, conscious still of the whispers that had never entirely died down about the timing of Catherine's birth and the circumstances of our marriage. But Marcus was serene, confident in a way he had not been before. "Let them whisper," he said when I expressed my concerns. "Let them speculate and gossip. None of it matters, Eleanor. We know the truth of what we are to each other, and that is enough. Those who matter will see our love and our family for what they are. The rest can think what they like." His certainty gave me courage, and when the guests arrived, I greeted them with my head high and Catherine on my hip. The very picture of a happy wife and mother with nothing to hide. The afternoon was a success beyond my hopes. The guests seemed genuinely pleased to be there, charmed by Catherine's precociousness and by the obvious warmth between Marcus and myself. I caught snatches of conversation that suggested whatever gossip had existed had largely faded, replaced by acceptance of the narrative we presented. "The Duke and Duchess are clearly devoted to each other," I heard one matron say to another. "Whatever the circumstances of their marriage, they have made it work beautifully. That is all that matters in the end." I nearly wept with relief. That night, after the guests had departed and Catherine was asleep and the house was quiet, Marcus and I stood at the window of our bedroom looking out over the moonlit moors. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked. "The forced marriage, the complications, the way your life was disrupted by my father's blackmail." He turned to me, pulling me close against his side. "Not for a single moment," he said firmly. "Without your father's interference, I would have lived out my days alone, consumed by guilt, having never known what I was capable of feeling. I would never have held Catherine, never have heard you laugh, never have experienced the joy of being truly loved. Your father gave me back my life, Eleanor. in the strangest and most unexpected way possible. How could I regret that? I leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart beneath my cheek. I used to be so angry with him, I confessed, with my father, for using me as a pawn in his game, for not asking what I wanted, for making choices about my life without my consent. But now I find that anger has faded, replaced by something closer to gratitude. Not for his methods, which were still wrong, but for his ultimate wisdom in seeing what we could not, that we were meant for each other, even if we needed to be pushed together to discover it. We stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, looking out at the wild beauty of the landscape that had once seemed so forbidding and now felt like home. So much had changed since that first gray morning when I had arrived at Ashford Hall, terrified and alone and convinced my life was over. So many revelations, so many moments of pain and discovery and unexpected grace. We had been forged by fire, Marcus and I, hammered into something stronger and more resilient than either of us would have become alone. In the years that followed, we continued to build our life together. Catherine grew into a bright, confident girl who showed no signs of the complicated circumstances of her conception. She had siblings eventually, 2 more daughters, and then finally a son who would carry on the Ashford name and title. Each child was loved completely, without distinction or favor, each one a gift we treasured. Marcus proved to be as devoted a father to all of them as he had been to Catherine, and watching him with our children never failed to move me. This man who had been so isolated, so consumed by guilt, had become the warm center of a thriving family. We faced challenges, of course. No life is without difficulty, and ours had more than our share of complications. There were years when crops failed and tenants struggled, when we had to make hard choices about the estate. There were illnesses and losses, the inevitable sorrows that come with living. But we faced everything together, partners in the truest sense, and that partnership sustained us through whatever came. Marcus's guilt over Uncle Richard never entirely disappeared, but it transformed over time into something gentler, more like wistful regret than the crushing burden it had once been. He established a scholarship in Richard's name for young men who wished to study at university but lacked the means, and he made annual donations to charities Richard had supported. These acts of remembrance and atonement seemed to bring him peace, a way of honoring the man he had wronged while still allowing himself to live fully in the present. We spoke of the past sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet and we were alone with our thoughts. We would remember those early days of our marriage, the coldness and distance, the secrets and revelations, the slow building of trust that had led to love. It felt almost like remembering another life. So different was our present from those difficult beginnings. But we agreed it had been necessary, every painful step of the journey, to bring us to where we were now. We had earned our happiness through hard work and honesty and the choice, made again and again, to see the best in each other even when it would have been easier to focus on the worst. Sometimes I would read my father's letter again, the one that had finally explained his reasoning and given us his strange blessing. Each time I read it, I understood him a little better, saw a little more clearly the man behind the manipulations. He had loved me in his way, even if that love had manifested in control and coercion. He had loved his brother, even if that love had been complicated by promises he could not fully honor. He had been deeply flawed, capable of cruelty, but also capable of a kind of wisdom that saw beyond the immediate pain to possibilities that might emerge from it. I could not entirely forgive him, but I could acknowledge the debt I owed to his interference, however unwelcome it had been at the time. Marcus and I made a pilgrimage once to Uncle Richard's grave, taking Catherine with us, though we did not explain the full significance of the visit. We stood together before the weathered headstone, and Marcus spoke quietly, words I think he had been waiting years to say. "I am sorry," he said. "Sorry for that night, for my cowardice, for the loss I caused. I have tried to be better, to live in a way that would honor your memory. I hope that wherever you are, you know that your death was not meaningless, that it changed me, made me strive to be worthy of the second chance your forgiveness granted. Thank you for that mercy. I will never forget it. Catherine picked wildflowers that grew nearby and placed them on the grave, a child's simple offering, and I thought about the strange connections that bound us all together across time and death. My uncle, whose death had seemed like a simple tragedy, my father, who had carried secrets and pain for so long, Marcus, who had spent a decade trying to atone, and me, caught up in all their stories and ultimately made better by the complicated legacy they had left. We were all connected, all part of a larger story that was still being written with each day we lived and each choice we made. As the years passed and I grew older, watching my children grow and eventually begin families of their own, I often reflected on the nature of happiness and how unexpectedly it can arrive. I had not chosen this life, had not wanted to marry Marcus or come to Ashford Hall. If given the choice at 18, I would have run in the opposite direction, would have fought with everything I had against the marriage my father forced upon me. And I would have been wrong. I would have missed the greatest love of my life, the truest partnership I could have imagined, the family that brought me more joy than I had ever dreamed possible. There was a lesson in that, I thought, about the limitations of our own vision, about how we cannot always see what is best for us in the moment. Sometimes we need to be pushed, forced, manipulated even, into situations that terrify us, but which contain the seeds of transformation. My father had understood that, or perhaps had simply been lucky in his manipulation, crafting a punishment for Marcus that became a blessing for us both. On our 25th wedding anniversary, Marcus gave me a gift that moved me to tears. It was a book, leather-bound and beautiful, and inside were all his diary entries from the past 2.5 decades. He had copied them out himself, every word creating a chronicle of our life together from his perspective. "I have no more secrets from you," he said, as I turned the pages with trembling hands. "This is my heart, laid bare. Every doubt and fear and moment of joy recorded honestly. I want you to have it, to know that I have held nothing back, that you have all of me completely." I read those entries over the following weeks, living again through our courtship, if it could be called that, through Catherine's birth and the growth of our family, through challenges overcome and love deepened. What struck me most was the constancy of his devotion, present even in the early entries when I had thought him cold and indifferent. He had loved me almost from the beginning, had seen something in me worth cherishing even when I could not see anything of value in myself. That knowledge was a gift more precious than any jewel or property could have been. I wrote my own account then, matching his honesty with my own, recording my journey from terrified bride to contented wife, from naive girl to woman who had learned the complicated nature of love and forgiveness. When I gave it to him, bound in the same style as his gift to me, he wept openly. "We have given each other everything," he said. "Our pasts and presents, our flaws and virtues, our complete selves without reservation. That is the rarest of treasures, Eleanor, to be known fully and loved completely. That is what we have built together." As I write these final words, looking back over the decades of our marriage, I am overwhelmed by gratitude for the strange path that brought me to this moment. I am grateful for my father's manipulation, for Marcus's guilt that drove him to be better, for Lord Pemberton's cruelty that gave us Catherine, for Uncle Richard's deathbed mercy that set everything in motion. I am grateful for every difficult conversation, every moment of painful honesty, every choice to forgive and trust and love despite the reasons we had to do otherwise. But most of all, I am grateful for Marcus, for the man he was and the man he became, for his fierce protection of our family and his gentle love for me. He taught me that people are not defined by their worst moments, that redemption is always possible for those willing to do the hard work of change. He showed me that love built on truth and tested by adversity is stronger than any romance built on illusion and fantasy. He gave me a life I never asked for, but which became more precious to me than anything I could have chosen for myself. We are old now, Marcus and I, our hair silver and our steps slower than they once were. But when he looks at me across a room, I still feel that flutter in my chest, still see in his eyes the same devotion that has sustained us through all these years. Our children visit with grandchildren in tow, filling the house with noise and life, and Catherine, now a mother herself, sometimes asks about the early days of our marriage. I tell her carefully edited versions, stories of two people learning to love each other, finding unexpected joy in an arranged match. She does not need to know all the complicated truths, not yet, perhaps not ever. The moors outside our window look as they always have, wild and beautiful and unchanging. But everything else has changed, has been transformed by time and choice and the love we poured into every day. Ashford Hall is no longer the cold fortress it seemed when I first arrived, but a warm home filled with memories and hope. The past still exists, still shapes us in small ways, but it no longer has power over our present. We have made peace with it, Marcus and I, made peace with our fathers and their choices, with our own mistakes and limitations, with the complicated path that brought us together. If I could go back to that frightened girl stepping out of the carriage on a gray November morning, I would tell her that everything would be all right, more than all right. I would tell her that the cold, distant Duke would become the love of her life, that the forced marriage would become the greatest gift she ever received, that the pain she was experiencing was the price of admission to a happiness she could not yet imagine. But perhaps it is better that I cannot go back, cannot offer that reassurance. Perhaps we need to walk through the darkness without knowing the light that waits on the other side. Perhaps that is what makes the light so precious when we finally reach it. Marcus found me here at the window, writing these reflections, and he wrapped his arms around me from behind, his chin resting on my shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, and I leaned back into his embrace. "Everything," I replied. "Our whole life together, how we started and where we have arrived. How much I love you. How grateful I am for every day we have had, even the difficult ones." He turned me to face him, his hands gentle on my shoulders. "We have been blessed," he said softly, "beyond what either of us deserved, beyond what I ever dared hope for. You made me believe in redemption, Eleanor. Made me believe I could be more than my worst moment. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to keep trying to be better every day. I cannot imagine what my life would have been without you, and I am grateful every moment that I never have to find out." I reached up to touch his face, this face that had become more dear to me than my own, and smiled through the tears that seemed to come so easily now in my old age. "We were given a second chance," I said, "both of us. A chance to become better than we were, to build something beautiful from broken pieces. We took that chance, Marcus. We worked for it, fought for it, chose it again and again, even when it was hard. That is what I am most proud of. Not that we were lucky or blessed, but that we did the work required to transform our forced beginning into a love that has sustained us for 25 years. He kissed me then, soft and sweet and full of all the years we had shared, and I tasted salt from tears I was not sure were his or mine or both. The sun is setting now over the moors, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple, and Marcus has gone to check on the evening preparations for dinner. Our children will be arriving soon with their families, gathering to celebrate this anniversary, this milestone of a marriage that should never have worked, but which became the foundation of everything good in both our lives. I will close this account now, seal it away with Marcus's diaries and my father's letters, a record of how love can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances if we are brave enough to let it. To anyone who might read this in years to come, know this: we are not defined by how our stories begin, but by how we choose to continue them. Marcus and I were forced together by blackmail and guilt, by death and manipulation and secrets that should have destroyed any chance of happiness. But we chose differently. We chose honesty and forgiveness and the hard work of building trust from nothing. We chose to see each other clearly, flaws and virtues both, and love what we saw. We chose each other again and again until that choice became as natural as breathing. That is the gift my father gave us, wrapped in cruelty and control, but a gift nonetheless. He forced us to begin, but we chose to continue. We chose to transform obligation into love, distance into intimacy, guilt into grace. And in doing so, we discovered that the deepest happiness often comes not from the easy path or the chosen road, but from learning to love the journey we find ourselves on, unexpected though it may be. That is our legacy, mine and Marcus's. Not perfection, but transformation. Not a fairy tale, but a true story of redemption and love that was hard-won and all the more precious for it. And I would not change a single moment, even the painful ones, because they made us who we are. Two people who found each other in darkness and built a life full of light.